Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows its footsteps, science takes the quieter road, and the old stones of the world are allowed to speak at their own unhurried pace. Tonight, we are travelling to Ethiopia, a land of high plateaus, deep valleys, ancient trade routes, sacred cities, and monuments that seem, at first glance, to belong neatly inside the history books. But the longer you look at them, the less neat they become. In the north, at Aksum, tall granite stelae rise and fall across the landscape, some carved like stone buildings, some broken, some still standing as if keeping watch over a memory no one has fully translated. UNESCO describes Aksum's largest fallen stele as about 33 metres long, possibly the largest monolithic stele ancient people ever attempted to raise, while the tallest surviving standing example reaches over 23 metres. At Yeha, stone walls built from finely dressed blocks still stand, with a precision that feels almost too calm for their age. The Great Temple, generally linked to the 1st millennium BCE, and described by archaeologists as a landmark of early monumental architecture in the region. Farther south, in the Gedeo landscape, thousands of megalithic stones stand among living farms, sacred forests, and long traditions that have not vanished into museum glass, but remain part of a human landscape still being used and remembered. And at Tiya, south of Addis Ababa, carved stelae bear swords, strange marks, and signs that scholars still describe as difficult to decipher, the remains of an ancient Ethiopian culture whose age has not been precisely determined. So tonight, we are not going to rush at these stones with a torch in one hand and a conclusion in the other. We are going to sit beside them for a while. We are going to ask what they are, what they are supposed to be, and why, in certain quiet moments, they seem to suggest something older than the kingdoms and societies officially credited with them. Not necessarily older in the dramatic sense of lost empires with golden machines and mysterious beams of light, which would admittedly make archaeology rather more lively, though probably very difficult to fit into a university funding application. Older in a more subtle way. Older like a habit passed down through generations. Older like a skill inherited before anyone wrote it down. Older like a road that later travellers use without knowing who first cleared the path. Because monuments can be built by one civilization and still contain the memory of another. A wall can be repaired by people who did not quarry its first stone. A burial marker can be raised in a landscape already sacred for reasons no one remembers. A symbol can be carved by hands that know the shape but not the full story behind it. And sometimes the deepest mystery is not that something exists, but that it exists in a place where the official timeline feels just a little too tidy. Before we begin, let me ask you something gentle. Where are you listening from tonight? And what old place near you has always made you wonder? It might be a ruined wall at the edge of a town, a standing stone in a field, an old church foundation, a cave, a hill, a road, or even just a strange lump of masonry that everyone walks past without asking too many questions. Every part of the world has these quiet survivors. They do not announce themselves loudly. They wait. And sometimes, when evening comes and the day becomes softer around the edges, it is easier to imagine that the past is not gone at all. It is simply standing very still. And if you find this journey calming, intriguing, or simply useful as a place to rest your thoughts for a while, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like, maybe subscribed, and stayed with us for more slow travels through the stranger corners of Earth's story. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might enjoy a peaceful wander through ancient mysteries without anyone suddenly shouting over a dramatic drumbeat. There will be no frantic countdowns here, no red arrows pointing at stones, no urgent warning that historians are terrified. Historians, for the most part, are usually not terrified. They are more likely to be cautiously interested, surrounded by papers and wondering where they left their reading glasses. But there are questions worth asking carefully, and Ethiopia's megaliths offer plenty of them. The phrase megalith simply means large stone, but as with many simple words, it hides a great deal. A large stone can be a marker, a tomb, a throne, a boundary, a calendar, a memorial, a warning, a ritual object, or a statement of power. It can say, "Here lies someone important." It can say, "This place belongs to us." It can say, "The ancestors are watching." It can say, "We know how to move what others cannot." And because stone lasts longer than wood, cloth, names, songs, and occasionally even common sense, it can remain long after the culture that raised it has changed beyond recognition. This is why megaliths are so difficult and so tempting. They look solid, but their meanings are slippery. You can measure the stone, map its position, photograph the carvings, test nearby charcoal, compare styles, and still be left with the same stubborn question. Who really began this tradition, and how much of what we see belongs to the visible civilization, and how much was inherited from something before? That is the delicate thread running through tonight's story. Ethiopia's famous stone monuments are often described in relation to the later societies around them, and in many cases that makes sense. Aksum was a powerful kingdom. Yeha was an important early centre. Gedeo's landscape preserves living cultural traditions. Tiya is associated with burials and regional megalithic practices. These are not imaginary contexts. They are real, studied, and important. But the problem with ancient stone is that it does not always carry a birth certificate. Carbon dating can date charcoal, bone, seeds, soil layers, or organic remains found near a monument. It can sometimes date material associated with a burial beneath it, or a ritual deposit beside it. But the stone itself, especially if it was quarried, shaped, moved, reused, re-erected, or left in place for centuries before someone later built around it, does not easily tell us the moment when human hands first transformed it. This does not mean every monument is secretly thousands of years older than scholars say. That would be too easy, and ancient history rarely rewards easy answers. It means there is room for caution. It means that a date from a grave near a stone is not always the same thing as a date for the first idea behind the stone, the first quarrying of the stone, or the first tradition that taught people why such stones mattered. And that distinction matters. Imagine finding an old family table in a house built in 1950. If you date the house, you might assume the table belongs to the same period, but perhaps the table came from a grandmother's house. Perhaps it was made 100 years earlier. Perhaps it had been repaired, polished, moved, and used by 3 generations who no longer remembered the carpenter's name. Archaeology faces similar puzzles, except the table is sometimes 20 meters tall, carved from granite, and lying in several enormous pieces because raising it did not go quite as planned. Which is, in fairness, a rather dramatic version of misplacing the furniture. Ethiopia is especially important because it sits at a crossroads of geography and history. It is not a remote blank space waiting to be discovered, as older colonial writing too often imagine African landscapes to be. It has been connected for thousands of years to the Red Sea, the Nile Valley, Arabia, the Horn of Africa, and the interior highlands. People moved through it, traded through it, built in it, worshipped in it, buried their dead in it, and adapted to its highland environments with remarkable skill. Its history is not a side note to other civilizations. It is one of the great centers of ancient human development and cultural complexity. And yet, because so much of the deeper past is fragmentary, because many traditions were oral, because stone survives unevenly, and because archaeology has not investigated every valley, terrace, and sacred grove, there are still gaps large enough for serious questions to breathe. When we look at Aksum, for example, we often begin with the known kingdom, the great trading power that flourished in the first centuries of the Common Era, minted coins, built monumental tombs, and stood among the major powers of its time. That is already impressive enough, no embellishment required. But then the stelae stand there, immense and silent, and the mind begins to ask practical things. Where was the stone quarried? How was it transported? How were workers organised? How did artisans learn to carve false doors, windows, beams, and stories of architecture into a single vertical slab? Why did this particular form become meaningful? Was it invented suddenly in a burst of royal ambition, or did it grow from older stonemarking traditions already present in the region? And if earlier traditions existed, how far back do they go? The mainstream answer may explain much of the visible monument, but it does not necessarily answer every inherited layer beneath the design. At Yeha, the question feels different. There, the power of the place is not in towering stelae but in walls. The great temple is often connected to South Arabian influence and the world of the ancient Sabaean cultural sphere, and that connection is important. Ancient peoples across the Red Sea were not sealed away from one another. They traded, migrated, borrowed, taught, married, worshipped, and built. Ideas crossed water more often than modern maps sometimes suggest. But standing before finely dressed stone laid with care, survived across centuries, one naturally wonders how such building knowledge arrived, how it was adapted, and what local traditions were already prepared to receive it. Skilled architecture does not appear in a vacuum. It needs quarrymen, masons, planners, labour organisation, religious authority, food supply, and a shared belief that such work is worth doing. A temple is not simply a pile of clever stones. It is a society expressing itself in weight. In Gedeo, the story widens into something almost overwhelming. The landscape is not a single monument that can be fenced off, labelled and neatly explained before lunch. It is a broad cultural landscape of farms, forests, sacred places and megalithic concentrations. Stones there are part of a living environment, not just abandoned relics. That makes them harder to interpret in one sense and richer in another. A standing stone among cultivated slopes may hold several lives at once. It may belong to an older burial practice, a later ritual memory, a local tradition, and a modern heritage identity. The difficulty is not that there is no meaning. The difficulty is that there may be too many meanings layered over time, and when thousands of stones are involved, the question shifts from who carved this one object to what kind of long-lived cultural system kept returning to stone as a way of speaking. Then there is Tiya, perhaps the most quietly unsettling of all. The site is famous not because its stones are the tallest, but because they seem to carry a message that has not fully reached us. Swords, marks, signs, forms that repeat and vary. The temptation is to call them mysterious and leave it at that, as though mystery were a conclusion rather than an invitation. But undeciphered symbols are not empty. They meant something to the people who carved them. They may have marked identity, status, death, victory, gender, lineage, ritual, or something we do not yet have the right category for. That last possibility is often the hardest to accept. Sometimes the past is not hiding an answer we already understand. Sometimes it is organised around assumptions that no longer fit easily inside our modern boxes. We look for kings, graves, warriors, priests, calendars, maps and names. The stones may be speaking of obligations, transformations, ancestral debts, or social ideas for which we have no simple translation. It is rather like finding a handwritten note in a language you almost recognise, then realising the handwriting is beautiful, the grammar is deliberate, and you still cannot order a cup of tea with it. What connects these places is not proof of one single lost civilization stretching across Ethiopia like a forgotten empire with matching uniforms and excellent stone-lifting committees. That would be an exciting claim, but excitement is not evidence. What connects them is something more cautious, and in some ways, more interesting. They suggest that Ethiopia's megalithic traditions may preserve deep continuities of knowledge. Different regions, different periods, different meanings, and yet again and again we find communities turning to large stone as a tool for memory, authority, burial, sacred geography and social identity. Some monuments may belong exactly where official dating places them. Others may include reused stones, older ideas, older sites, or traditions with roots extending beyond the visible archaeological horizon. The possibility worth exploring is not a single dramatic secret, but a long inheritance. A tradition may survive even when the names of its first builders do not. This is where the phrase, "aren't what they seem," becomes useful, but only if we handle it gently. It does not mean the stones are fake, wrongly described, or surrounded by a conspiracy. It means they may not be only what their most obvious context suggests. Aksum's stelae may be royal monuments, but they may also be the peak of a much older habit of marking power in stone. Yeha's walls may show external influence, but they may also reveal local readiness and pre-existing skill. Gedeo's stones may belong to known cultural traditions, but they may also preserve older sacred geographies absorbed into later life. Tiya's stelae may be funerary markers, but their symbols may encode a system that is not yet fully understood. In archaeology, the first label is not always wrong. It is often just incomplete. And perhaps that is why these monuments feel so compelling at night, when the world is quieter and the mind becomes less interested in neat answers. They remind us that history is not a straight hallway lined with labelled doors. It is more like an old settlement built over many earlier settlements. One floor covers another. A wall becomes a foundation. A sacred place remains sacred even after the language changes. A road continues to be used long after its first builders are forgotten. Civilizations rarely begin from nothing. They inherit tools, myths, roots, techniques, fears, ambitions, and stones. Especially stones. Stones are patient. They do not mind waiting for the next people to arrive and give them a new name. So as we begin this journey, let us keep two thoughts in mind at the same time. The first is respect for what careful archaeology has already shown. Ethiopia's ancient societies were fully capable of impressive engineering, long-distance trade, ritual complexity, and monumental ambition. We do not need to borrow builders from elsewhere or imagine impossible forces to explain human skill. The second is respect for what remains unknown. Dating is complicated. Cultural memory can be older than material evidence. A monument can have more than one life. And sometimes the stones we credit to one civilization may be the visible crest of a much deeper wave. Tonight, then, we will move slowly from place to place, not trying to force every stone into one grand answer, but listening for patterns. We will start in Aksum, where granite giants rise like carved towers and one immense fallen stele lies on the ground, as if the earth itself decided to keep hold of it. We will think about what it takes to quarry such a stone, shape it, move it, decorate it, and attempt to raise it into the sky. We will ask why a kingdom would carve architecture into a monolith, why tombs needed such vertical statements, and whether the Aksumite achievement may have drawn on older traditions already embedded in the highlands. Because before a monument becomes famous, before tourists photograph it and scholars measure it and guidebooks compress it into a paragraph, it begins as a decision. Someone, somewhere, looks at a mountain of stone and says, yes, that. Move that. Shape that. Stand that upright. And the real mystery is not only how they did it, but what kind of world made that decision seem necessary. Aksum is one of those places where the past does not feel buried so much as upright, visible, and quietly waiting in the daylight. You do not have to dig very far into imagination to feel it. The stones are there, some are standing, some are broken, some lie flat across the earth like fallen towers that once tried to become part of the sky. And around them is the old city itself, a place woven into Ethiopian history, royal memory, Christian tradition, ancient trade, and the long movement of people between Africa, Arabia, the Red Sea, and the wider world. It is easy, when first hearing about Aksum, to reduce it to a sentence. Ancient capital, powerful kingdom, tall stelae, royal tombs, very impressive. Now please move along to the next glass case in the museum. But Aksum does not really behave like a sentence. It behaves more like a landscape full of commas, pauses, uncertainties, and large pieces of stone that seem to interrupt the easy version of the story. The Aksumite kingdom was real, powerful, and remarkable. That needs to be said clearly before we wander too far into the mist. This was not some vague tribal settlement accidentally surrounded by mysterious architecture. Aksum was one of the great states of the ancient world, a kingdom that rose in the highlands of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, traded across the Red Sea, minted its own coins, interacted with the Roman world, controlled routes of commerce, and later became one of the earliest major states to adopt Christianity. Its rulers had wealth, ambition, organisation, and a strong sense of how monuments could express authority. So when we stand before the stelae of Aksum, the mainstream explanation begins in a sensible place. These were royal and elite monuments, probably associated with underground tombs, raised during the height of Aksumite power, especially around the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. UNESCO describes several surviving stelae at Aksum as dating between the 3rd and 4th centuries, with the largest fallen example measuring around 33 metres and perhaps having collapsed during the attempt to raise it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art similarly describes the stelae as indirectly dated to the 3rd and 4th centuries and associated with a royal necropolis near the religious centre of Aksum. That explanation is important, and it should not be brushed aside simply because mystery is more atmospheric. But the more carefully we look at the stones, the more we see that the obvious answer may not be the whole answer. The great stelae are not just markers. They are carved from single blocks of stone, shaped into tall narrow forms and decorated on their faces with patterns that resemble multi-storey buildings. There are false doors. There are rows of false windows. There are details that look like beams, panels, frames, and entrances, all translated into stone as if a building had been flattened, stretched upward and taught to stand still forever. The tallest standing stele rises over 23 metres, while the greatest fallen one, sometimes called the Great Stele, was longer still. To say that people carved a large stone is technically correct, in the same way that saying a whale is a damp mammal is technically correct. It does not quite give the thing its proper weight, and weight matters here. These stones were not little memorial slabs that could be carried politely under one arm by someone with admirable posture. They were immense monoliths, cut from hard local stone, shaped with skill, dragged or transported across the landscape, and then lifted into position with methods that remain partly uncertain. The famous stele taken to Italy during the 20th century, and later returned to Ethiopia, is about 24 metres tall and weighs around 160 tons, according to descriptions of the monument. The Great Stele was far larger. Estimates of its weight vary, but even cautious numbers place it in the range of several hundred tons. Imagine organising that task without cranes, diesel engines, hydraulic jacks, safety helmets, radio communication, or a supervisor named Kevin holding a clipboard and saying, "Right lads, just a little to the left." Ancient engineering was not primitive engineering. It was engineering under different constraints. It relied on human labour, animal power where available, sledges, rollers, levers, ramps, ropes, earthworks, repeated effort and knowledge built from experience rather than instruction manuals. This is where Aksum begins to feel less like a simple monument field and more like a question about inherited knowledge. To quarry a monolith is already a serious undertaking. Someone had to identify suitable stone, understand how it would fracture, separate it from the bedrock, and shape it without destroying it. Someone had to decide how the stone would look before it was moved, because carving a tall decorated monolith after it had been raised would make certain details rather inconvenient, unless one had a fearless team of ancient scaffold users and absolutely no fear of dropping chisels on colleagues below. Then the stone had to be moved. The route had to be prepared. Obstacles had to be cleared. People had to be fed. Labour had to be coordinated. The project had to be socially meaningful enough that a community or a kingdom would invest enormous effort in something that did not grow crops, carry water, or make daily life easier in any obvious way. Monumental architecture always asks the same practical question. Who could command this much work? But it also asks a quieter one. Who taught them that this was the right way to remember the dead, display power, or speak to the ancestors? The official answer usually links the largest Aksumite stelae to royal tombs. That fits much of the evidence. Beneath and around the stelae field are tombs, chambers, and elite funerary architecture. The stones seem to have marked graves, especially the graves of rulers or high-status people. Their carved doors may symbolize entrances to the world below, or to the house of the dead, or to a grand eternal dwelling made not of timber and mud, but of stone. In that sense, the stelae were vertical tomb architecture. They did not merely sit above the dead. They announced that the dead still occupied a structured place in the social and sacred world. Even after breath ended, rank remained. Even after the body vanished, the stone still stood up and made its declaration. But here is the interesting part. Aksum's stelae do not all look alike. Some are huge and elaborately carved. Others are smaller, rougher, simpler, and much less polished. The broader Aksum landscape includes hundreds of stelae, including rough-hewn examples in nearby fields. The Metropolitan Museum notes nearly 120 in the main stelae park, and many more rough-hewn examples to the west in the Gudit field, associated with a non-elite necropolis. That variety suggests development, social difference, and perhaps a long tradition with several layers. The royal stelae may be the grandest expression of a practice that already existed in simpler form. A king does not always invent a tradition when he makes it enormous. Sometimes he takes something older, something ordinary people already understand, and enlarges it until it becomes royal. A village marker becomes a palace monument. A burial stone becomes a granite tower. A remembered custom becomes state theatre, with rather more stone dust. This does not prove that the Aksumite stelae were first raised by some lost civilization long before Aksum. It does not prove that the great stones were reused from a vanished culture, or that the Aksumites merely inherited ready-made monuments. Those claims would require much stronger evidence than a feeling of surprise in front of a very large rock. But surprise can still be useful if it makes us ask better questions. When archaeologists date a monument, they often rely on associated material. They may date burials, inscriptions, pottery, charcoal, organic remains, or construction layers connected with a site. That can tell us when a tomb was used, when a surface was occupied, or when a particular ritual took place. But a stone itself is difficult to date in the same way. Unless it preserves tool marks that can be matched to a period, or is sealed in a context that clearly shows when it was shaped and raised, the age of the stone as a human object can be harder to prove than the age of the things found near it. This is not an accusation against archaeology. It is one of the careful limits archaeology has to live with. Stones are stubborn witnesses. They tell us where they are, what they are made of, and how they have weathered. They do not politely say, "I was quarried on a Tuesday in the year 312 shortly after lunch." So when people ask whether Aksum's granite giants might preserve an older tradition, the most responsible answer is not a dramatic yes or a dismissive no. It is a slower answer. The Aksumite kingdom almost certainly raised the famous royal stelae as part of its own funerary and political world. But the practice of standing stones, the meaning of vertical markers, and the technical knowledge needed to handle large stone may have roots that reach earlier than the most famous monuments themselves. That is not only possible, it would be normal. Cultures inherit. They do not wake up one morning with an entirely new symbolic language and a sudden urge to drag hundreds of tons of stone across the highlands. Skills grow through use. Meanings gather like dust, except more dignified and harder to sweep away. There is also the matter of style. The decorated Aksumite stelae look like buildings. This is one of their most striking features. The carved false windows and doors seem to turn the stone into a kind of petrified architecture. A building usually welcomes people inside. A stele cannot. It offers the image of entrance without entry. It is a door no living person can open, a house no one can inhabit, a tower that represents space while remaining solid. That makes sense in a funerary setting. The dead are present but inaccessible. The tomb is beneath, the stone is above, and the carved door marks the boundary between worlds. But where did that idea come from? Was it an Aksumite innovation? Was it inspired by wooden or stone architecture that already existed? Was it a local development shaped by older burial customs? Or was it influenced by contacts across the Red Sea and transformed into something distinctly Ethiopian? These possibilities do not cancel one another. Ancient cultures were not school exam answers where only one box may be ticked. They were messy, connected, adaptable, and occasionally very good at borrowing an idea and making it entirely their own. The Aksumite world was deeply connected. Ships moved across the Red Sea. Goods travelled between the Ethiopian highlands, the Nile Valley, Arabia, the Mediterranean, and India. Ivory, gold, aromatics, textiles, metals, and ideas moved through these networks. Aksum was not isolated, and its monumentality should be understood in that wider context. But connection is not the same as dependency. For a long time, African monuments were too often explained as if their builders must have learned everything important from somewhere else. That old habit says more about the biases of earlier scholarship than about the abilities of ancient Africans. Aksum's monuments belong first to the world that raised them. External influence may have played a role in certain forms, symbols, or techniques, but influence does not move a 160-ton stone. Local people did. Local labour did. Local authority did. Local knowledge did. If an idea crossed the sea, it still had to become Ethiopian in stone, and yet local knowledge itself may have a deeper ancestry. That is the balance worth holding. We do not need to imagine outsiders arriving with secret blueprints, nor do we need to imagine Aksumite builders appearing from nowhere with fully developed monumental engineering. Between those two extremes lies something more realistic and more interesting. A long regional tradition of stone use, burial marking, sacred landscapes, quarrying, and social memory, gradually intensified by the power of the Aksumite state. The larger stelae may represent not the beginning of the tradition, but its summit. They may be the moment when older customs were lifted into royal scale. If so, the question of who raised them first becomes layered. The Aksumite kings may have raised the famous examples. Earlier communities may have raised simpler stones. Still earlier groups may have marked burial places, boundaries, or ritual sites in ways that left fewer traces. A single monument can stand at the end of a long chain of remembered gestures. Think of it like language. When a poet writes a beautiful sentence, we credit the poet. But the words themselves are older, the grammar is older, the rhythms may be older still. The sentence is new, but it carries inherited speech. Aksum's great stele may work in a similar way. The royal monument is Aksumite. The carved form is Aksumite. The funerary context is Aksumite. But the impulse to turn upright stone into memory may belong to a much older human vocabulary. And in Ethiopia, where megalithic traditions appear in multiple regions and forms, that vocabulary seems to have been unusually rich. There is something almost unsettling about the great stele lying broken where it fell. If it did collapse during erection, as UNESCO suggests may have happened, then it captures a rare moment in ancient engineering, ambition meeting gravity rather abruptly. We usually see completed monuments and imagine ancient builders as either perfect masters or mysterious magicians. A fallen monolith reminds us that they were neither. They were skilled people working at the edge of what was possible. They calculated, organised, and attempted. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes the stone won. In a way, the fallen great stele may be more revealing than a perfectly standing monument. It shows that Aksumite builders were pushing scale to a dangerous limit. They were not merely reciting a safe old routine. They were experimenting with grandeur, testing how far inherited methods could be stretched before the earth quietly said no. And that failed attempt, if failed is even the right word, raises another question. Why make it so large? A functional grave marker does not need to be 33 metres long. A stone that size is not practical. It is political, symbolic, theological, emotional, or all of those at once. The very excess is the point. It declares that the person beneath, or the authority behind the monument, belongs to a category beyond ordinary life. Monumental excess is a language of power. It says, we can gather the workers, we can command the quarry, we can move the mountain, we can make stone imitate architecture, we can speak to the future in a voice too heavy to ignore. Of course, the future can be rather rude. It may forget your name, mispronounce your titles, and ask whether someone else built your monument, but it will still notice the stone. The question of who raised them first, therefore, has at least two meanings. On the surface, it asks who physically built the stelae we see at Aksum. The best evidence points to the Aksumite civilization, particularly its elite and royal culture in the early centuries of the Common Era. But beneath that, the question asks who first created the tradition that made such monuments meaningful. Who first stood a stone upright in this landscape and connected it with death, memory, power, or sacred presence? Who first learned which rock could be shaped, which slopes could be crossed, which tools worked, which ropes held, which songs kept labour moving, which rituals made the work acceptable to the living and the dead? Those people may never have minted coins or left royal inscriptions. They may not appear in the official story as kings, but without them, later monuments may have had no cultural soil to grow from. Aksum's stelae also challenge the way we imagine progress. We often picture history as a staircase. First people do simple things, then slightly better things, then impressive things, then very impressive things, and eventually someone invents customer service music, which is where progress becomes debatable. But real history is not so tidy. Skills can appear, disappear, return and transform. A society may master one kind of building and ignore another. A technique may be preserved by specialists whose names are never recorded. A later kingdom may inherit a landscape already filled with sacred stones and decide to claim that landscape by adding bigger ones. The monuments of Aksum may therefore mark both innovation and continuity. They may be new in form but old in impulse. They may belong to a specific kingdom while also echoing practices older than that kingdom. This is especially important because Aksum did not rise in an empty land. The northern Ethiopian highlands had long histories before the kingdom reached its height. There were earlier settlements, earlier ritual practices, earlier forms of social organisation, earlier connections across the Red Sea, and earlier experiments in monumental or ceremonial building. Yeha, which we will come to soon, is often associated with the first millennium BCE and shows that complex stone architecture existed in the region centuries before the great Aksumite stelae. That does not mean Yeha's builders made Aksum's monuments. It means the world from which Aksum emerged already knew how to organise stone, labour and sacred authority on a major scale. Aksum inherited a region with deep architectural memory, and architectural memory can be as powerful as written memory, sometimes more so because it is learned by hand. A mason teaches a mason, a quarry worker teaches a quarry worker. A ritual specialist explains where a stone may stand and where it must not. The knowledge passes through bodies, tools, and habits long before it is written down. There is also a quiet emotional side to all of this. The stelae of Aksum were not built for us. They were not built to puzzle documentaries, decorate postcards, or give modern people something to argue about in comment sections. They were built for the dead, the living, the ancestors, the gods, the kingdom, and perhaps for future generations within that same cultural world. Their builders were not trying to be mysterious. They were trying to be understood by people who shared their symbols. The mystery appears because we arrive late, very late. We arrive after languages have shifted, rituals have changed, tombs have been disturbed, stones have fallen, kingdoms have transformed, and explanations have thinned. Then we stand there with measuring devices and theories, trying to reconstruct the obvious from fragments. It is rather like walking into a conversation just as everyone else has left the room, then confidently analysing the furniture. Still, the stones do speak in the ways stones can. Their scale says organisation. Their carving says skilled design. Their location says funerary and ceremonial meaning. Their variety says social hierarchy and development. Their survival says continuity and rupture. Their silence says caution. And that silence is perhaps the most important part. It reminds us not to flatten the past into either mainstream certainty or alternative certainty. The Aksumite explanation is strong, but it's not complete in every detail. The older civilization idea is intriguing, but it must be handled as a possibility of inherited traditions, not as a finished verdict. Between those two positions is a more careful mystery. The stones may not be older than Aksum as objects, but the knowledge, symbolism, and sacred habits that made them possible may reach deeper than the visible kingdom, and perhaps that is enough to make Aksum's granite giants feel different, not because they need to be stolen from the people history already credits, but because they may reveal how much those people themselves inherited. Aksum's builders were not less impressive if they drew on older traditions. They were more impressive. They knew how to transform memory into power. They took the language of upright stone and expanded it until it became architecture, tomb, monument, and royal statement all at once. They made the dead visible. They made authority vertical. They made granite behave, at least for a while. And when one stone became too ambitious and fell, even that failure became part of the story, a reminder that ancient people were not working with fantasy, but with real weight, real danger, and real human effort. So as we leave the steely field in our minds, not too quickly, because places like this should never be hurried, we can imagine the work before the monuments became ruins, the quarry ringing with tools, the stones slowly separating from the earth, the planners measuring, arguing, adjusting, perhaps making the ancient equivalent of a worried face, the labourers pulling in rhythm, the ropes tightening, the dust rising, the elite watching, the priests or ritual specialists preparing the correct words, the tomb below waiting in darkness, the stone inching upward, becoming not merely a block, but a presence. And somewhere behind that moment, behind the kingdom, behind the royal names, behind the official dates, there may have been older hands, older markers, older beliefs about stone and death and memory, all feeding into the great vertical gesture of Aksum. From there, the trail leads us back before Aksum's highest royal monuments into the earlier architecture of the northern highlands, where another site waits with a very different kind of stone mystery. Not a forest of towering grave markers, but walls so precisely fitted that they seem to hold their age with unusual confidence. At Yeha, the question is not how high stone can be raised, but how carefully it can be placed, and what kind of society already knew how to build in a way that still feels quietly exact after more than 2,000 years. From the vertical ambition of Aksum, where granite was asked to stand like a royal declaration, the path leads to a quieter kind of achievement. Yeha does not impress by trying to pierce the sky. It impresses by staying put. Its mystery is not a towering stone that fell under its own impossible ambition, but walls that have held together across centuries with a calm that feels almost suspicious. At Aksum, the question is how people raise such enormous carved monoliths. At Yeha, the question is how people shaped, placed, and fitted stone so carefully that the building still seems to be explaining patience to the rest of us. If Aksum says, "Look how high we can reach," Yeha says, "Look how long we can endure." Yeha lies in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, about 53 kilometers west of Aksum, in a fertile highland basin surrounded by volcanic mountain chains. UNESCO's tentative listing describes it as a place containing the great temple of Yeha, the Gubri Palace, and rock-cut tombs dating to the early and middle 1st millennium BCE. It also notes that the Great Temple is usually dated to around the 7th century BCE, dedicated to the god Al-Maka, and built with large dressed stone blocks joined in dry masonry without mortar. That is the neat description. A temple, a palace, tombs, a date, a god, a region, a building technique, all very tidy. But Yeha itself, like most ancient places that have survived long enough to become famous, is not quite tidy. It is layered, used, reused, damaged, restored, worshipped in, studied, photographed, argued over, and still sacred. It is not simply a ruin. It is a place where history did not stop moving just because archaeologists arrived with notebooks. The Great Temple is the centerpiece. It is rectangular, roughly 18.5 by 15 meters, with a single entrance, and its walls still survive to a height of about 14 meters. UNESCO describes the blocks as regular rectangular dressed stones, some up to 3 meters long, placed without mortar, with outer faces, edges and corners carefully worked to create the impression of a highly unified stone structure. Now, dry masonry may sound simple at first. No mortar. Stack stones. Try not to let them fall over. But that is rather like describing surgery as cutting carefully and hoping for the best. Building high walls without mortar requires precision, weight distribution, stable foundations, excellent stone dressing, and a deep practical understanding of how blocks behave when time, weather, gravity, and perhaps the occasional earthquake decide to be unhelpful. Mortar can forgive small mistakes. A slightly uneven block can be cushioned. A gap can be filled. A joint can be persuaded into looking respectable, rather like a poorly folded bedsheet tucked under a mattress. Dry masonry gives the builder fewer hiding places. The stone must fit. The weight must settle properly. The wall must hold because the geometry, mass and craftsmanship are doing the work. That is why Yeha's walls feel so important. They are not just old, they are disciplined. The blocks were not randomly gathered from a field and piled up by optimistic people with strong backs. They were selected, quarried, transported, dressed, measured, arranged, and fitted into a design that required planning long before the first course was laid. And while we should not exaggerate the mystery into something impossible, neither should we flatten it into a casual accomplishment. A 14-metre wall made of carefully dressed blocks without mortar is not a weekend project. It is not something one begins after breakfast because the weather is pleasant and the goats are busy elsewhere. It demands social organisation. It demands specialists. It demands authority. It demands a reason powerful enough to draw labour away from ordinary survival and into sacred construction. This is where the accepted story of Yeha becomes both useful and interesting. Archaeologists generally place Yeha within the world of early complex societies in the northern horn of Africa, often linked to the polity known as Demt or Da'amat, and a cultural contact between local communities and Sabaean groups from South Arabia. The German Archaeological Institute describes research at Yeha as focused on a historic cultural sphere combining indigenous and foreign traditions with evidence of settlement going back to the late 2nd millennium BCE, though Yeha became a supra-regional centre in the 1st millennium BCE. That is an important detail. Yeha did not simply appear in the 7th century BCE as a finished temple in the middle of nowhere, like an ancient architectural delivery that someone forgot to sign for. There was earlier settlement, there were regional developments, there were local communities already in place. Then, in the early 1st millennium BCE, something changed. New networks, new forms of authority, new architecture, new religious expressions and new connections across the Red Sea helped turn Yeha into a major centre. The Sabaean connection matters, but it also needs careful handling. Older histories often had a bad habit of explaining impressive African monuments by looking away from Africa as quickly as possible. If something was large, precise, or old, someone would eventually suggest that outsiders must have been responsible, preferably outsiders with inscriptions, ships, and a more comfortable place in 19th century European imagination. That way of thinking is not just outdated, it is lazy. Yeha was not a passive recipient of civilization. It was a highland centre where local and foreign traditions met, mixed, and became something specific to the Northern Horn. The DAI describes the beginning of the first millennium BCE as a period of cultural change associated with migration from South Arabia, but it also frames Yeha through both indigenous and foreign traditions. That combination is the key. Contact does not erase local agency. Influence is not ownership. A building technique may have parallels elsewhere, but the people who quarried the stone, carried it, laid it, worshipped in the building, repaired it, and kept the place sacred were part of the Ethiopian landscape. Still, the precision of Yeha's masonry raises a fair question. How much of this knowledge arrived with cultural contact, and how much was already developing locally before the grand buildings were made? A style can be imported more quickly than a skill can be mastered. You can see a foreign temple and decide to copy its outline. You can adopt a deity's name, a script, or a symbol through trade and migration. But building a stable dry stone temple with large dressed blocks requires more than taste. It requires training. It requires quarry knowledge. It requires tools. It requires people who understand stone not as an idea, but as a material that cracks, chips, shifts, settles, and occasionally behaves with all the cooperation of a sleeping donkey. If Yeha's builders were working in a South Arabian tradition, they still needed local technical mastery to make that tradition stand on Ethiopian ground. And here the mystery becomes subtler than a simple "who built it" question. The Great Temple may well belong to the 7th century BCE and to the society archaeologists identify at Yeha. But the skill behind it may have deeper roots. That is not unusual. Large monuments often appear suddenly in the archaeological record because earlier stages were built in perishable materials, smaller forms or less visible ways. Wood rots, mud brick erodes, smaller stones are reused, ritual spaces can shift. The first surviving version of an architectural tradition is not always the first version that ever existed. It is simply the first one lucky enough, or massive enough, or well positioned enough to survive. Yeha may preserve the moment when a long-developing local capacity met new religious and political ambitions and became monumental stone. The foundation itself tells part of that story. A building of this height and weight cannot survive without a stable base. UNESCO notes the excellent engineering techniques of the Great Temple and the careful dressed stonework of the walls. Stability begins before the visible wall. The builders had to understand the hilltop, the bedrock, the drainage, the slope, and the pressure of the structure above. A wall is not merely a vertical arrangement, it is a negotiation between stone and earth. If the ground shifts, the wall answers. If water enters, the wall remembers. If a foundation is uneven, time will eventually reveal the mistake, often with the quiet cruelty of a crack. Yeha's survival suggests that its builders were not experimenting blindly. They had a practical command of construction, whether learned locally, through contact, through earlier traditions, or through all of these at once. Inside the walls, the construction becomes even more interesting. UNESCO describes the wall as not just a single structure, but as two walls interconnected by smaller blocks that serve as anchors, with a total thickness of about 60 centimetres. It also describes a carefully constructed floor with 5 layers of dressed stone blocks of different sizes. That is not decoration. That is engineering. The visible surface is only part of the achievement. The hidden parts, the anchoring blocks, the layered floor, the internal logic of the structure matter just as much. Ancient architecture often impresses modern visitors through what can be photographed, but builders know the real intelligence of a structure is often where tourists cannot see it. A wall survives not because its outer face is handsome, though that helps at dinner parties, but because its internal arrangement distributes pressure and resists failure. The temple's later history also complicates the story in a useful way. The building was converted into a Christian church or monastery space in the 6th century CE, and it remains a sacred place for Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. UNESCO notes that the temple was converted to a monastery in the 6th century CE, with a baptistry found inside, and that the monastery moved to its nearby present location in the early 20th century. This means Yeha has lived more than one life. It was not abandoned, forgotten, and rediscovered as a dead object. It was reinterpreted. A sacred building dedicated to Al-Makka became absorbed into a Christian sacred landscape. The stone stayed, but the meaning changed. Or perhaps some meanings changed while others remained. Sacredness, authority, antiquity, the sense that this was not an ordinary place. Buildings like this do not simply carry one date, they carry episodes. A date for construction, a date for destruction, a date for reuse, a date for restoration, a date for modern study. The more lives a building has, the more careful we must be when asking what it really is. There was also damage. The German Archaeological Institute's reporting notes that a disastrous fire, probably in the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, badly damaged the temple, destroying the entrance porch, upper story and inner wall shell, with later restoration work needed because the structure was at risk of collapse. Fire is an odd partner to stone. We think of stone as immune, but buildings are rarely only stone. Roofs, beams, floors, doors, screens, offerings, furniture, and inner supports can burn. Heat can crack stone. Collapse can rearrange evidence. Later repairs can hide or remove earlier traces. So when we look at Yeha's surviving walls, we are seeing both endurance and loss. The walls are magnificent, but they are not the entire original building. They are what remained after use, destruction, conversion, and conservation. The silence of Yeha's engineering is partly the silence of missing parts, and yet the missing parts may be just as revealing as the surviving ones. The Great Temple likely had elements that are now gone, including an entrance porch and upper structures. The DAI account of restoration mentions the entrance porch originally supported by 6 pillars, and the temple's upper story and inner wall shell being destroyed by fire. This means the building was not just a simple stone box. It had architectural complexity. It had vertical development. It had spaces, supports, ritual movement, and probably a visual presence that approached travellers from a distance. A temple on a hilltop is never only for those who enter it. It is for those who see it from afar. It announces a centre. It turns geography into authority. It tells merchants, farmers, pilgrims, rulers and visitors that this place matters before they arrive. In a world of trade routes and highland settlements, visibility was communication. The temple was not whispering. It was speaking across the basin. Nearby, the Gratbial-Gubri structure expands the picture. UNESCO describes it as a palace dating to the 8th century BCE, with a square ground plan of about 60 by 60 metres, a stepped podium up to 6 metres high, and monumental entrance features including monolithic pillars, each weighing about 20 tons. It is described as the largest known timber frame building in East Africa and South Arabia, and an important example for understanding building traditions in the Northern Horn. The DAI also describes a multi-storied palace built around 800 BCE, with a 60 by 60 metre floor space, made of wooden beams and rubble stones, and identifies it as the largest stone and timber building so far known in East Africa and South Arabia. This is important because Yeha's engineering was not limited to one temple. It was part of a wider built environment: sacred buildings, administrative or elite structures, tombs and settlement areas. A single impressive monument could be an anomaly. A whole monumental landscape points to organised complexity. This is where the idea of inherited knowledge becomes stronger, though still not a license for careless conclusions. Yeha's builders were operating within a society capable of planning large buildings, cutting tombs into rock, working stone, using timber-framed architecture, and maintaining religious and political institutions. UNESCO's tentative listing describes Yeha as a political, religious and cultural centre of highly centralised complex societies in the early 1st millennium BCE, and says the site preserves evidence for early complex culture in the Northern Horn. A society like that does not appear from a blank page. It grows from earlier communities, earlier experiments, earlier social hierarchies, earlier trade relationships, and earlier sacred places. The late 2nd millennium BCE settlement evidence mentioned by the DAI matters because it reminds us that Yeha had a prehistory before its grandest architecture. The temple may date to the 7th century BCE, but the place had already been lived in and known. So when someone says Yeha's walls may preserve traces of a much older forgotten civilization, we need to slow down and define what that could reasonably mean. It does not have to mean a lost empire with its own vanished alphabet and a complete architectural manual hidden under a suspiciously convenient slab. It may mean that the visible 1st millennium BCE monuments crystallise knowledge that had been developing for centuries among local highland communities. It may mean that earlier building traditions in wood, stone, mud, and ritual space prepared the ground for the temple. It may mean that the people of Yeha inherited sacred geography from communities whose names are lost, then rebuilt that sacred geography in a new monumental language shaped by South Arabian contact and local power. In that sense, Yeha could be both what archaeology says it is and more than it seems. A 7th century BCE temple, yes. A product of Diemt and Sabian local interaction, yes. But also a visible surface of older social memory, technical learning, and place-based continuity. The danger is to confuse "not fully explained" with "therefore anything is possible." Ancient stones are often treated that way. A gap in the evidence becomes a doorway through which every theory is invited, some wiping their feet, others tracking mud all over the carpet. But good mystery does not need wild certainty. Yeha is already extraordinary without making it impossible. The real challenge to the mainstream timeline is not that archaeologists are obviously wrong about the temple's date. It is that dating the surviving structure does not necessarily date the first traditions that made such construction meaningful or possible. Just as with the Aksumite stelae, the physical monument has one history, while the ideas and skills behind it may have a longer one. Stone can mark a moment, but technique is often older than the monument that displays it. This distinction matters especially with monumental architecture. When we see a perfectly dressed stone block, we are seeing the final product of many invisible steps. Someone had to know where suitable stone could be found. Someone had to know how to cut it. Someone had to know how to move it without ruining the edges. Someone had to know how to lay it so the wall remained level. Someone had to check alignment. Someone had to coordinate the rhythm of work. Someone had to judge when a block was good enough, when it needed more dressing, and when a mason was perhaps becoming too confident and should take a small break. Those judgments are learned. They are not invented fresh for every project. They belong to communities of practice. And communities of practice can survive across political changes, religious changes, and even language changes. A ruler may commission a temple, but the mason's hand carries older lessons. Yeha also reminds us that ancient Ethiopia was never outside history's main current. It was not waiting at the edge of the map for civilization to arrive. It was part of a dynamic Red Sea world, connected to South Arabia, but not defined only by it. Cultural exchange is visible in religion, writing, architecture and political forms, while local traditions shaped how those influences were adopted. UNESCO describes Yeha as representing cultural exchanges between populations of the Northern Horn and South Arabia, visible in architecture, construction techniques, metalworking, stone masonry, common script, religion, and cult practices. Exchange like that is not a one-way lecture, it is a conversation. Sometimes unequal, sometimes practical, sometimes sacred, sometimes commercial, but always changed by the people on both sides. The Great Temple may speak with a South Arabian accent, but it stands in an Ethiopian sentence. The more one thinks about the dry masonry, the more it becomes a metaphor, though a very practical one, not the kind that floats away before breakfast. Each block depends on the others. The wall holds because many separate stones have been shaped to work together. A society works the same way. Priests, builders, farmers, herders, traders, rulers, quarrymen, woodcutters, potters, metalworkers and families are all part of the structure. Remove enough of them and the monument never rises. Yeha's walls are silent because stone does not narrate labour. It does not tell us who cut their hand, who argued over measurements, who sang while hauling, who resented the project, who believed in it, who supervised it, who prayed in it, who swept its floor, or who watched the smoke rise when fire damaged it. But the work is still there. The silence is not emptiness. It is compressed human effort, and there is something very human in the later reuse of the temple as a Christian sacred place. A new faith did not simply erase the old stones, it inhabited them. That may seem strange at first, but it is one of the most common patterns in human religious history. Sacred places tend to remain sacred even when the explanation changes. A hilltop temple becomes a church, a spring becomes a saint's site, a standing stone becomes a boundary, then a legend, then a tourist stop where someone inevitably drops a sandwich. People rarely abandon powerful places completely. They rename them, reinterpret them, repair them, and bring them into the next world of meaning. Yeha's continued sacredness may be one reason it survives so well. Buildings that remain meaningful are more likely to be protected, even if they are also altered. Reverence can be a form of conservation, though it does not always follow modern museum rules. So what does Yeha suggest about Ethiopia's megalithic and stone-building past? It suggests that by the early 1st millennium BCE, the Northern Horn possessed societies capable of major architectural planning, precise masonry, long-distance cultural exchange, and monumental sacred construction. It suggests that local and South Arabian traditions combined in ways that produced distinctive forms. It suggests that Aksum, centuries later, did not emerge from nothing but inherited a landscape already marked by complex architecture, sacred centres, and stoneworking traditions. UNESCO's listing even describes Yeha's 1st millennium BCE complex society as a significant cultural development later transmitted into the Aksumite kingdom. That line is easy to pass over, but it matters. Transmission means inheritance. It means that Aksum's later stone world had ancestors, not necessarily a single lost civilization hiding behind every monument, but earlier centres of power and knowledge whose achievements shaped what came next. This changes the way we look back at Aksum's granite giants. They no longer seem like isolated marvels from a sudden golden age. They become part of a longer regional story in which stone had already been used to express authority, sacredness, and technical control. Yeha's walls do not explain exactly how Aksum's stelae were quarried or raised. The skills are different. A dry masonry temple is not a monolithic funerary stele, but both require organised labour, stone knowledge, planning, and a belief that permanence matters. Both turn geology into memory. Both show that the highlands of northern Ethiopia developed a remarkable architectural language over many centuries, and both raise the same careful possibility. When we credit later civilizations with monuments, we may be naming the visible builders while missing the older traditions they drew upon. Standing in front of Yeha's walls, the temptation is to ask where the secret is hidden. Is it in the joints, the quarry marks, the measurements, the South Arabian parallels, the local tombs, the older settlement beneath and around the famous structures? But perhaps the secret, if that is even the right word, is not hidden in one block. It is in the continuity. It is in the way a place can be settled, then expanded, then monumentalized, then burned, then reused, then sanctified again, then studied, then restored, while still holding together enough of its first form to make modern visitors go quiet. Yeha's walls are not silent because they have nothing to say. They are silent because their message was built into fit, weight, height, and endurance, not into a language most of us can read. And now the story begins to widen again, because Yeha shows us early stone architecture in the north, tied to temples, palaces, trade, and state formation. Aksum shows us later royal stelae, tied to tombs, power, and a kingdom that reached across the Red Sea world. But Ethiopia's megalithic puzzle is not confined to the northern highlands. Far to the south, the landscape changes, and so does the scale of the mystery. Instead of one great temple with carefully fitted walls, we find something more dispersed, more numerous, and in some ways harder to hold in the mind. Fields and clusters of standing stones spread through the Gedeo cultural landscape, where megaliths are not just ancient objects, but part of a living terrain of farms, forests, memory and community. Farther south, away from the royal stelae of Aksum and the dry masonry walls of Yeha, Ethiopia's stone story becomes less like a single monument and more like an entire landscape breathing through memory. In Gedeo, the stones do not gather in one tidy ruin, waiting politely behind a signboard. They spread across ridges, farms, sacred groves, and inhabited slopes. They stand among trees, soil, crops, pathways, and communities that have not withdrawn from the land but continue to live with it. If Aksum feels like a royal cemetery speaking in granite, and Yeha feels like architecture holding its breath, Gedeo feels like a forest of markers whose full meaning has not been cut away from daily life. It is not only an archaeological site, it is a lived-in place where old stones and living traditions overlap, sometimes clearly, sometimes confusingly, and often in ways that resist the neatness we try to bring with us. The Gedeo cultural landscape lies along the eastern edge of the main Ethiopian rift, on the steep escarpments of the Ethiopian highlands. UNESCO describes it as an agroforestry landscape, where large trees shelter inset, coffee and other crops, and where the traditional knowledge of the Gedeo people supports local forest management. Within these cultivated mountain slopes are sacred forests used for ritual purposes, while dense clusters of megalithic monuments stand along the mountain ridges and have been revered by the Gedeo and cared for by elders. That setting matters. The stones are not isolated from their environment. They are part of a landscape where farming, forest protection, ritual, memory and community governance are all connected. To understand Gedeo's standing stones only as carved objects would be rather like trying to understand a tree by looking only at a fallen leaf and ignoring the roots, the soil, the shade, the rain, and the person sitting beneath it wondering whether they remembered to bring lunch. What makes Gedeo especially striking is the scale. Archaeological summaries and research reports commonly describe the Gedeo zone as containing more than 10,000 stelae across numerous sites, making it one of the densest known concentrations of such monuments in Africa. Recent research on Gedeo's megalithic stelae sites notes that the region contains thousands of stelae, varying in construction time, size, function, engraved signs, and landscape arrangement, and that existing evidence places the earliest known stelae construction in southern Ethiopia between the 1st centuries BCE and CE. That number is difficult to picture properly. 10 stones, perhaps, the mind can arrange. 100 stones becomes a field. 1,000 stones becomes a tradition. 10,000 becomes something else altogether. It becomes a social habit written across generations. It becomes labour repeated so often that standing stone was not an exception, but a language. A very heavy language, certainly, and not one ideal for quick messages, but a language all the same. This is why Gedeo changes the mood of the mystery. At Aksum we are impressed by size, at Yeha by precision, at Gedeo by repetition. One stone might be explained by one ruler, one burial, one event, one ambitious project, or one family with unusually strong opinions about memorial design. Thousands of stones require a broader explanation. They imply a tradition that endured across time and changed as it moved from place to place. Some stelae may have marked burials, others may have served ritual, ceremonial, territorial, ancestral, or social purposes. Researchers have noted that Gedeo stelae vary not only in form and decoration, but also in function and the scale of labour invested in them. Some burial markers appear to have required less energy than stones raised for other purposes, suggesting that not all megaliths were doing the same social work. And that is important, because one of the easiest mistakes we make with ancient monuments is assuming that similar-looking objects must have had the same meaning. Humans are rarely so convenient. Walk through the idea of Gedeo slowly, and the practical questions begin to pile up in a quiet but persistent way. Who selected the stones? Who shaped them? Where were they quarried? How far were they moved? Were different quarries used for different communities or purposes? Did certain shapes carry specific meanings? Did taller stones imply higher status, older memory, ritual power, or simply a family that had more relatives available for pulling? Were stones raised all at once in ceremonial events, or gradually over time? Were they aligned with paths, ridges, graves, clan territories, water, forests, or sightlines? Was a stone complete when it was raised, or did it gain meaning through later rituals? These are not small questions. Each one opens into the organisation of past societies. A standing stone may look simple, but it is the final visible result of many hidden decisions. And in Gedeo, those decisions were repeated again and again. This matters because repetition is evidence of social structure. It tells us that communities knew what a standing stone was for, even if we do not. They knew where such stones belonged. They knew who had the authority to raise them. They knew how labour should be gathered, how the work should be performed, and what rituals or obligations surrounded the act. That knowledge does not need to be written down to be real. In many societies, the most important rules are not found in books. They are remembered through practice, elders, ceremonies, stories, prohibitions, and the simple fact that everyone knows what is done because it has always been done. Archaeologists sometimes find the object and lose the rule. The stone remains. The social instructions have gone quiet. The idea that Gedeo's stones may preserve traces of older knowledge does not require us to imagine a single vanished empire hiding beneath the farms. It asks us to think about continuity in a landscape where tradition is unusually visible. UNESCO emphasises that the Gedeo cultural landscape is a long-standing and still living indigenous tradition, sustained by layered agroforestry, sacred forests and community knowledge systems such as the Songo Council of Elders and the Bali system governing interaction with nature. That does not mean the present Gedeo community built every ancient stele or preserved every original meaning unchanged. Cultures change, people move, practices are reinterpreted. But it does mean that the stones exist in a landscape where memory has not been completely severed from place. They were revered and cared for. They were not merely abandoned rubble. And when monuments remain ritually important after their first builders are gone, their meanings can be both preserved and transformed. This is one reason Gedeo is so difficult to interpret with a simple timeline. Some research suggests megalithic stele construction in Gedeo began around 2,000 years ago, earlier than some previous estimates, while other sites in the wider Ethiopian stele tradition date to later centuries. But a date attached to a monument, especially when derived from associated materials, is not always the same as the age of the tradition behind it. This is the point that keeps returning gently but stubbornly, like a kettle that keeps clicking after you thought it had finished boiling. Carbon dating can date charcoal, bone, seeds, or other organic material found in connection with the site. It can help establish when people used a place, when a burial occurred, or when a deposit was made. But the stone itself may have a more complicated life. It may have been quarried earlier, moved later, reused, re-erected, reshaped, or incorporated into a ritual system older than the dated material nearby. This does not mean the dates are wrong. It means they need to be read carefully. Archaeological dating gives anchors. It does not always give the whole coastline. In Gedeo, the question becomes even more layered because the stones are not all identical. Some are plain, some are shaped, some are phallic in form, some have engravings, some stand in clusters, some are fallen, some are associated with burial or ritual contexts, while others may have had different purposes. UNESCO notes that some of the megalithic monuments are steles and others are phallic forms, and that they were revered and protected within the traditional landscape. Variety is not disorder. It may be the opposite. It may reflect a rich symbolic system in which form, size, placement and decoration each mattered. To an outsider, two stones may look broadly similar. To the people who raised them, the difference between one shape and another might have been as meaningful as the difference between a wedding ring, a gravestone, a boundary post, and the little note on the fridge that says, "Please do not eat my pudding." Objects can be simple in shape and complicated in meaning. The labour behind the stones deserves patience too. The Gedeo stelae are not as enormous as Aksum's tallest granite giants, but quantity changes the calculation. Moving and raising one moderate-sized stone is hard. Doing it thousands of times across a landscape is a different form of achievement. It speaks of repeated mobilization, technical memory, and a shared willingness to invest labour in stone. Research on the Gedeo stele landscape has emphasised social labour investment, noting that the construction process involved carving, transport, emplacement, and relationships between stele sites and quarries. It also suggests that labour organisation and resource investment varied by site function and changed through time. That is a wonderfully practical way to approach mystery. Instead of beginning with the question, what secret did they know? We begin with, how many people did it take? How far did they move the stone? What tools did they use? What did they eat while doing it? And who decided it was worth all this effort? Ancient history is often more understandable when we remember that builders got tired. There's also a landscape logic to consider. The stones are not random. UNESCO describes dense clusters along mountain ridges within the broader Gedeo landscape, while the cultivated slopes, sacred forests, rivers, and agroforestry systems form part of the same protected cultural landscape. Ridge placement can matter for many reasons. Ridges are visible. They can mark territory. They can connect communities visually. They can serve ritual paths. They can stand above cultivated land, watching over fields and settlements. They can connect sky, earth, ancestors, and living people in ways that do not need to be mystical in the vague sense, but can be entirely practical within a society's worldview. A monument on a ridge is seen differently than a monument in a valley. It gathers sight. It claims height. It makes memory part of the horizon. Because Gedeo is still inhabited and farmed, it also raises an issue that many ancient sites do not. Heritage here is not simply about preserving dead stone. It is about protecting a living cultural system under pressure. UNESCO notes that the landscape supports a dense population, maintains biodiversity and coffee production, but is vulnerable to social and economic pressures that threaten its resilience. It also warns that traditional management systems have weakened, and that the authenticity and integrity of the landscape depend on sustaining the whole network of practices and attributes together. That gives the stones a modern urgency. They are not just clues to a forgotten past. They are part of a present landscape where people farm, manage forests, remember ritual places, and face development pressures. A megalith knocked over by road construction, agriculture, or neglect does not merely lose archaeological information. It loses part of a relationship between people and land. And this living context makes the idea of a forgotten civilization more complicated. Forgotten by whom? Not everything unknown to modern scholarship is forgotten by local people, and not everything remembered locally is preserved in a way that matches archaeology's preferred categories. A stone may be known as sacred, dangerous, ancestral, protective, or connected to elders, even if no one now remembers the exact person or event that first led to its raising. That is still memory, though not the kind that fits easily into a dated inscription. Western historical habits often privilege written records because writing is convenient, portable, and excellent for footnotes. But landscapes remember differently. They remember by keeping certain groves untouched, by maintaining paths, by repeating rituals, by telling children not to disturb certain places, by letting stones remain where they are. Such memory can thin, change, or become uncertain, but it should not be dismissed simply because it does not arrive in alphabetic form wearing a little academic jacket. The Gedeo stones challenge us because they belong to both archaeology and cultural landscape. They are material evidence, yes, but also part of a system of reverence and environmental management. The sacred forests near them are not a decorative background. They are part of how the landscape works. UNESCO describes parts of the natural forest as reserved for ritual purposes, where no trees are felled or cultivation practiced, preserving indigenous trees and medicinal plants. In many societies, sacred restriction is a form of ecological protection. A place becomes untouchable, not because someone read a conservation policy, but because tradition says it must remain protected. In this way, old belief can protect biodiversity with remarkable effectiveness, and the stones may have helped mark or reinforce such sacred zones. If that is true, then the megaliths are not just memorials of the dead. They may be part of a living boundary system between ordinary land and protected land, between use and restraint, between farming and reverence. This is why Gedeo's megaliths are not easily explained as only grave markers, though some certainly may have had funerary functions. Burial is often central to megalithic traditions around the world, but standing stones can do more than mark graves. They can gather ceremonies, they can anchor lineages, they can define sacred space, they can declare rights to land, they can symbolize fertility, ancestry, status, or transformation. In Gedeo, where stelae vary so much in form and site function, it is likely that multiple meanings existed at different times and places. Research summaries describe the monuments as products of social and ritual practices, with the wider distribution of stelae traditions in southern Ethiopia showing their important role in society, and many sites being places for ritual and ceremonial practices. That phrase, social and ritual practices, may sound modest, but it is doing a lot of work. It means the stones were not just objects, they were events. A stone was not only raised, it was made meaningful through the people gathered around it. Think for a moment about the moment of raising one. Not a royal Aksumite giant with a king's tomb beneath it, but a Gedeo stele in a ridge landscape. The stone has already been selected, perhaps from a known source. It has been shaped, perhaps engraved, perhaps left plain because plainness itself was appropriate. People have gathered. There is labour, but also expectation. The stone moves slowly, ropes strain, the ground is prepared, a pit may be dug, the stone is eased upward, rocked, steadied, fixed. There may be songs, offerings, words, instructions, prohibitions, laughter, worry, impatience, and someone standing too close who is gently but firmly told to move. When it finally stands, it changes the place. Before, there was a ridge. After, there is a marked ridge. Before, memory belonged to people. After, memory has a body. That is not primitive thinking. It is a sophisticated way of making social meaning durable. The possibility that Gedeo preserves older cultural layers is strongest when we consider how traditions accumulate. A later community can revere stones it did not build. It can add new stones to older clusters. It can reinterpret the old forms while preserving the practice of standing stones itself. It can treat inherited monuments as ancestral, sacred, or dangerous without remembering their original builders. Over centuries, this produces a landscape where different periods stand side by side. Some stones may be early, some later. Some may imitate earlier forms. Some may renew an old sacred place. Some may be moved or restored. The site becomes less like a single page of history and more like a notebook used by many generations. where some entries are clear, some are smudged, and someone has drawn a very determined-looking symbol in the margin. This is one reason the huge concentration of stones challenges simple historical timelines. It is not that the stones must all be older than current evidence suggests. It is that a tradition of such scale likely has roots, branches, and transformations that cannot be captured by a few dates alone. When researchers find evidence placing early stelae construction around the 1st centuries BCE or CE, that is already significant. It pushes the tradition deep into the past and makes Gedeo one of Ethiopia's earliest known megalithic stelae landscapes. But the cultural habits that made people choose stone may have formed before the earliest dated example we currently have. The first dated stone is rarely the first stone ever raised. It is simply the earliest one found, studied, and connected to datable material so far. Archaeology is always provisional in that sense, not uncertain in a weak way, but open in a disciplined way. New excavations can change old timelines. New methods can refine old dates. New surveys can reveal that what seemed isolated is actually part of a much wider pattern. Gedeo also complicates the idea of advanced stoneworking. We often use that word as if ancient skill has to resemble modern engineering to count. But advanced organisation does not always look like steel tools, written plans, or perfectly rectangular blocks. In Gedeo, the achievement may lie in social coordination, landscape memory, ritual continuity, and repeated stone raising across many communities. A stone does not have to be polished like Yeha's masonry to show intelligence. A tradition does not have to produce giant royal monuments like Aksum to show complexity. 10,000 stelae, varied in form and meaning, spread across a living landscape, may tell us something just as important, that communities had a long-term system for turning place into memory, and that system required knowledge. Not merely how to move stone, but when to move it, where to set it, who had the right to decide, and how the living should behave around it afterward. This brings us back to the larger question running through Ethiopia's megaliths. Are these monuments only the products of the civilizations and communities officially credited with them, or do they preserve traces of something older? In Gedeo, the answer may be both simpler and harder than expected. The stones belong to the region's known cultural landscape. They're connected to local tradition, ritual care, and archaeological histories of southern Ethiopia. But they may also preserve older layers of social memory that are not fully visible through excavation alone. A sacred ridge may have been sacred before the latest stones were raised. A form may have been copied long after its first meaning shifted. A community may have inherited a landscape already marked by stones and then added its own. In that sense, Gedeo does not need a single hidden civilization to be mysterious. Its mystery lies in duration, and duration is difficult for modern minds. We live in a world where objects are replaced quickly, buildings are demolished within decades, and many of us change phones more often than ancient people changed sacred landscapes. A tradition that lasts for centuries or millennia feels almost strange. But in landscapes like Gedeo, continuity is not a romantic idea. It is practical. Agroforestry itself depends on long-term thinking. Trees grow slowly. Inset cultivation requires knowledge. Sacred forests survive because generations agree, formally or informally, not to destroy them. Megaliths belong comfortably in such a world because stone is also long-term. It asks people to think beyond a single season. It says, this place will matter after we are gone. That may be one of the most important meanings of all. These stones therefore stand between two kinds of time. There is archaeological time, measured in dates, layers, typologies, and material remains. And there is cultural time, carried through practice, reverence, memory, and place. They do not always line up neatly. A stone dated to one period may participate in traditions older or younger than itself. A living ritual may preserve a relationship to a site while forgetting the first event. A community may protect a monument because it is sacred, not because it appears in a heritage inventory. That is why Gedeo feels less like a solved sight and more like a continuing conversation. The stones do not sit outside human life, they remain surrounded by it. As we move through this forest of standing stones in the mind, it is worth resisting the urge to make them all say one thing. Some may have watched burials, some may have marked rites of passage, some may have stood for ancestors, fertility, boundaries, or ceremonies no longer remembered. Some may have been raised by communities whose names are gone. Some may have been cared for by later people who gave them new meaning. Some may still hold meanings that outsiders have not been taught to recognize. The truth may not be a single answer hidden beneath one stone, but a pattern spread across many ridges. A long tradition of shaping memory through stone, renewed and reinterpreted again and again. And then, as the Gedeo ridges fade behind us, the story narrows once more from thousands of stones to a smaller group that has become one of Ethiopia's most famous megalithic puzzles. At Tiya, the stones are fewer, but their surfaces speak more directly and more strangely. They carry carved signs, weapons, shapes and marks that seem almost readable, almost familiar, and yet remain just out of reach. If Gedeo overwhelms us with abundance, Tiya unsettles us with symbols. There, the question is not only who raised the stones, or how old the tradition may be, but what message was carved into them, and why that message has become so difficult for us to hear. After the abundance of Gedeo, where standing stones spread through a living landscape like a long memory repeated across ridges, Tiya feels at first almost modest. There are not thousands of monuments gathered there. There is not the towering royal height of Aksum, nor the tightly fitted stone discipline of Yeha. Tiya is smaller, quieter, and easier to walk through in the mind, and yet somehow it may be one of the most difficult places to leave behind, because at Tiya the stones do not only stand, they are marked, they carry shapes carved into their surfaces, and those shapes seem to approach the edge of language without fully crossing over. They look intentional, they look repeated, they look as though they're telling us something. But the message has not arrived complete. Tiya lies south of Addis Ababa, in the Sodo region, and UNESCO describes it as one of the most important of roughly 160 archaeological sites discovered there. The site contains 36 monuments, including 32 carved stelae covered with symbols, most of which are difficult to decipher, and UNESCO identifies them as the remains of an ancient Ethiopian culture whose age has not yet been precisely determined. That phrase is quietly powerful. Difficult to decipher. Not meaningless, not decorative in the casual sense, not random marks left by bored ancient people who had finished their chores early and found a stone conveniently nearby. Difficult to decipher. It means there is pattern, but not enough certainty. There is structure, but not a key. There is a sign, but not yet a sentence we can confidently read. The stones at Tiya are often described as funerary monuments. UNESCO's activity page says that archaeological excavations show the site contains graves, and that originally 46 stelae were erected in the cemetery between the 10th and 15th centuries. It also notes that the carvings include swords and other enigmatic signs unlike those of other regions, while reminding us that Ethiopia's tradition of erecting megalithic monuments is very ancient, with some examples dating from before the Common Era. Already we have the familiar tension. On one side, a cemetery, graves, and a proposed date range for the monuments. On the other, an ancient regional tradition of megalith building, a culture not precisely dated in every respect, and symbols that remain uncertain. Tiya is not an empty mystery, but it is not a closed book either. It is more like a book left open in the rain, where some words are clear, others blurred, and one suspects the missing pages may have been very important. The first thing people notice in descriptions of Tiya is usually the swords. They appear again and again on the stelae, carved in a way that feels deliberate and formal. A sword is a strong symbol almost anywhere. It can suggest violence, authority, status, masculinity, warrior identity, protection, conquest, sacrifice, or the memory of conflict. But symbols are dangerous when they look familiar. A modern viewer sees a sword and immediately begins filling in the blanks. Ah, a warrior. Ah, a grave. Ah, a victory. Ah, someone important who owned a rather serious piece of metal and perhaps was not invited to many quiet garden parties. But the people who carved the swords at Tiya may not have meant exactly what we expect. A sword can be literal, but it can also be symbolic. It can represent a weapon, but also a rank, an achievement, a ritual role, a social category, a lineage, or a mythic idea. It may count something, it may name something, it may protect the dead, it may warn the living, it may say, this person fought. Or it may say something closer to, this person belonged to a class of people whose identity is now difficult for us to reconstruct. That is the problem with almost readable symbols. They invite confidence too quickly. A carved weapon seems easier to understand than an unknown geometric mark, but that ease can be a trap. Think of a modern grave marker with a cross, a military insignia, a national flag, a rose, a lamb, a pair of clasped hands, or a musical note. None of those symbols is random, but none can be fully understood without cultural context. A rose may mean love, grief, beauty, religious devotion, youth, or simply that the person's family liked roses. A flag may signal military service, patriotism, identity, or burial practice. A musical note might mark a musician, a favourite song, or a family joke no stranger could possibly recover. Now, imagine someone 2,000 years from now finding a gravestone decorated with a tiny football, a Wi-Fi symbol, and the words, "Gone fishing." The excavation report might become rather imaginative. The Tiya symbols ask us to be careful in exactly that way. They may look familiar in parts, but the full code belongs to a world no longer standing beside the stones to explain itself. Some of the signs at Tiya are not swords. There are shapes often described as enigmatic, and in various accounts these have been compared to plant forms, geometric marks, or other symbolic figures. UNESCO's French and Spanish descriptions specifically mention carved representations of swords and enigmatic symbols, and the English description emphasises that most of the symbols are difficult to decipher. The repetition matters. If one stone had one strange mark, we might treat it as decoration, accident, or personal expression. But repeated symbols across multiple stelae suggest a shared system. A system does not have to be writing in the strict sense. It may not represent sounds or words. It may be heraldic, ritual, genealogical, numerical, funerary, or emblematic. It may be closer to badges than sentences. But repetition means the marks were recognised by the people who made them. They belonged to a visual language, even if not a written language, and when a visual language is lost, it becomes one of the most tantalising kinds of silence. This is where Tiya differs from Aksum. At Aksum, carved architecture gives us a broad idea of what the stelae were doing. They imitate buildings, mark tombs, and express royal power. There is still mystery, but the grammar of power is fairly visible. At Yeha, the walls speak through construction. They tell us about planning, masonry, and sacred architecture. At Gedeo, the sheer number of stones tells us about a widespread tradition of memory and ritual in the landscape. But Tiya gives us symbols on a manageable number of stones, and that makes the mystery feel almost personal. We are close enough to see the marks, but too far away to know them. It is like hearing a conversation through a wall. You catch the tone. You know something important is being said, but the words remain muffled, and there is always the faint temptation to pretend you understood more than you did. The funerary context is important. Graves beneath or near stelae suggest that these were markers for the dead, perhaps for people of special status, perhaps for a group defined by age, rank, achievement, or identity. But even if we accept that Tiya is a cemetery, that does not solve the symbols. A cemetery can encode many kinds of information. They can mark families, social classes, ritual roles, causes of death, achievements, ancestry, gender, age, or spiritual beliefs. The dead are rarely just dead in human societies. They become ancestors, warnings, examples, memories, protectors, dangerous presences, beloved relatives, founders, heroes, or obligations. The living do not place effort into graves simply because bodies need somewhere to go. They place effort into graves because the dead continue to matter. The Tiya stones therefore may have stood not just to say someone is buried here, but to define who that person became after death in the eyes of the community. The dating issue returns here, quietly but firmly. UNESCO's activity page gives a broad 10th to 15th century range for the cemetery stelae, while the main World Heritage description says the age of the ancient Ethiopian culture represented at Tiya has not yet been precisely determined. Those statements are not necessarily contradictory. One can have approximate dates for monument use or associated burials, while still not fully understanding the culture's duration, origins, or development. But this is exactly why Tiya is so useful for our larger question. Dating graves can tell us when people were buried. Dating charcoal or organic remains can tell us when burning, burial, or occupation happened. But stone itself may be older than the burial it marks, or the tradition behind the stone may be older than the dated cemetery phase. A stone can be quarried, shaped, used, reused, moved, or reinterpreted. A symbol can survive long after its first meaning begins to change. A cemetery can be established in a place already considered sacred because older stones or older memories were there first. None of this proves that Tiya was built by an unknown civilization far earlier than the accepted range. But it does remind us that the date of an associated deposit is not always the birth date of a tradition. Imagine a family graveyard used in the 19th century on land that had been sacred for 500 years. If an archaeologist dates the coffins, the cemetery becomes 19th century. That may be perfectly correct for those burials, but it would not automatically date the first sacred use of the place, or imagine a medieval church built with stones taken from an older temple. The church date is real. The stones have another story, or imagine a symbol carved in the year 1200, copied from a symbol whose meaning was already ancient, already inherited, already partly obscure even to those who carved it. These are not wild possibilities. They are ordinary historical processes. People reuse places, they borrow signs, they inherit rituals, they keep forms long after explanations change. Human culture is full of traditions that continue because they feel necessary, even when no one agrees exactly why. At Tiya, the uncertainty is intensified by the broader Ethiopian megalithic background. UNESCO specifically notes that the tradition of erecting megalithic monuments is very ancient in Ethiopia, with some dating before the Common Era. That does not make Tiya itself prehistoric in every sense, but it places Tiya inside a much older habit of standing stones in Ethiopian landscapes. This is the important point. Tiya may be later than some other megalithic traditions, and yet still preserve older forms of meaning. A monument does not need to be the earliest example of a tradition to reveal the depth of that tradition. Sometimes later, examples are better preserved, more decorated, or more visible. They show us a practice after centuries of development, when the symbolic system has become rich enough to carve, but perhaps too localized or too unwritten for outsiders to decode. There is a quiet irony in the fact that Tiya became a World Heritage Site partly because of the uniqueness of these monuments, while their meaning remains uncertain. The site was inscribed in 1980, and UNESCO lists it under cultural criteria connected to its value as an archaeological heritage site. In other words, the world recognized Tiya as important before the world could fully explain it. That happens more often than we might think. Heritage is not always a reward for solved puzzles. Sometimes it is a promise to protect the puzzle while we continue learning how to ask better questions. This matters because ancient sites are fragile. A carved stone can stand for centuries and still be damaged in a moment by neglect, weather, theft, careless development, or one person deciding that ancient symbols would look nice in a private garden, which is not archaeology, but interior decorating with a criminal aftertaste. The stones at Tiya also sit within a region where many other archaeological sites have been discovered. UNESCO's figure of roughly 160 sites in the Soda region suggests that Tiya is not alone, even if it is the most famous. That surrounding density is essential. A famous site can become isolated in public imagination, as if it landed there by itself, complete and unexplained. But archaeological sites usually belong to networks. There may be nearby settlements, paths, burial areas, quarries, ritual places, agricultural systems and other monument clusters. Tiya's symbols may only be fully understandable within that wider regional world. Looking at the stelae alone may be like trying to understand a sentence by studying one word written in beautiful handwriting. The word matters, but the rest of the page matters too. The exact identity of Tiya's builders remains debated and uncertain in popular discussion, though the archaeological framing is careful. They were part of an ancient Ethiopian culture, associated with graves and a wider megalithic tradition. It is tempting to ask for a name. Humans like names. Names make the past feel organised. The Aksumites, the Sabaeans, the Egyptians, the Romans. Names are useful labels, and without them history becomes a cupboard full of unmarked jars. But many ancient communities did not leave us labels we can confidently attach to their monuments. Or if they had names, those names were spoken, not written. Or if they were written, the writing has not survived. Tiya may represent one of those societies whose material expression outlasted its self-description. The stones remain, while the name is gone. That should not make the people behind them less real. If anything, it should make them more human. Most people in history were not named in royal inscriptions. Most lives vanished from written record entirely. Yet they built, buried, remembered, mourned, and marked the earth. The sword carvings may suggest warriors, but even that possibility opens more questions than it closes. Were these graves for warriors who died in battle? For men of a certain rank? For people who had killed enemies? For ritual specialists associated with protection? For a society in which weapon imagery signified adulthood, authority, or social transformation? Were multiple swords counted? And if so, what were they counting? Victories, burials, lineage members, ceremonial achievements? Or were the swords less literal than we imagine, perhaps symbols of passage between life and death? Without inscriptions we cannot safely answer, but the very difficulty tells us something. This was a society with symbolic complexity. People did not simply place plain stones over graves. They carved a visual system into them that suggests shared values, shared memory, and a community that understood status or identity through signs. The enigmatic marks may be even more important than the swords. A sword can draw attention because it is recognisable, but the less familiar signs may carry the deeper code. They might represent plants, tools, body parts, ritual objects, numerical markers, clan signs, cosmological ideas, or categories that do not translate neatly into our terms. One of the hard lessons of archaeology is that ancient people did not organise reality for our convenience. They did not sit around thinking, in many centuries a documentary narrator will need a simple explanation. Let us make this symbol obvious. Instead, they carved for themselves, their dead, their communities, and their ritual worlds. If a sign was obvious to everyone present, no explanation was needed. The more universally understood a symbol was in its own time, the less likely anyone was to leave a helpful label for strangers in the future. Obvious things are often the least documented. No one writes an instruction manual for a door handle until the civilization that used doors has vanished. Tiya also makes us think about literacy in a broader sense. The symbols may not be writing, but they still record meaning. We sometimes divide societies too sharply into literate and non-literate, as if only alphabetic or syllabic writing counts as serious memory. But monumental symbols can act as durable records. They can encode identity, obligation and story without spelling words out. A coat of arms is not a sentence, but it can carry centuries of family meaning. A road sign is not literature, but it can change behaviour instantly. A religious symbol can carry a whole theology without a paragraph attached. Tiya's stelae may have worked in that territory between art, sign, emblem and memorial. They may not be readable as text, but they were almost certainly readable to the people who mattered. And then there is the physical act of carving. These were not painted signs that could be changed easily. They were cut into stone. That choice matters. Carving is commitment. It takes time, skill, tools and confidence. The person carving had to know the symbol's correct form, or at least the acceptable variation of it. Mistakes in stone are harder to hide than mistakes in conversation, though many of us still try. The depth, placement, repetition, and arrangement of symbols may all have mattered. A sword placed high may not mean the same thing as one placed low. A cluster of signs may create a composition. The relationship between a carved face and a grave beneath may have had meaning. If some stelae were oriented in particular ways, the direction of the carved signs may have mattered too. Every practical detail invites interpretation, and every interpretation needs evidence. This is where Tiya quietly challenges the mainstream timeline in a very specific way. Not by proving that scholars have placed the stones in the wrong millennium, but by showing how incomplete a date can feel when meaning remains undeciphered. A monument dated between the 10th and 15th centuries still leaves us asking what older symbolic traditions fed into it. A cemetery date still leaves us asking whether the site had earlier significance. A carved sword still leaves us asking whether the symbol began in that period or was inherited from an older ritual vocabulary. The stones may belong to a later phase of Ethiopian megalithic history, but their visual language may preserve older ideas, perhaps transformed beyond easy recognition. In that sense, Tiya is not simply late or early, it is layered. Layering is one of the great themes of Ethiopia's megaliths. At Aksum, royal stelae may have magnified older practices of standing stone and funerary marking. At Yeha, 1st millennium BCE stone architecture may have drawn on earlier local skills while absorbing cross-Red Sea influences. At Gedeo, thousands of stones suggest long continuity across a living landscape. At Tiya, a smaller cemetery of carved stelae seems to preserve a symbolic system we can see but not fully read. None of these sites requires us to imagine one single lost civilization responsible for everything, but all of them encourage us to think in terms of inherited knowledge. People build with what they receive. They receive techniques, places, symbols, stories, and obligations. They may innovate boldly, but innovation usually grows out of something already present. Even the strangest monument has ancestors. This does not make the builders of Tiya less impressive. Quite the opposite. If they inherited older symbols and reshaped them for their own dead, they were participating in a deep cultural conversation. If they created the signs themselves, they developed a complex funerary language whose key has not survived. Either way, the stones show a society capable of organised burial practice, symbolic carving, and shared meaning. That is enough to deserve attention without needing to force the site into fantasy. Real ancient people are more interesting than the invented ones because they had to solve problems with actual tools, actual bodies, actual weather, actual grief, and actual social obligations. A fictional lost civilization can do anything the storyteller wants. The people of Tiya had to raise stones that would stand, and grief may be at the centre of it. It is easy to become absorbed in dates, symbols, and theories, but cemeteries begin with loss. The stones marked people who died. Beneath the archaeological questions are human ones. Who was buried there? Who carried the body? Who chose the stone? Who carved the signs? Who stood nearby as the grave was closed? Who returned later to remember? The dead at Tiya were not evidence when they were buried. They were relatives, leaders, rivals, companions, perhaps warriors, perhaps ritual figures, perhaps ordinary people made extraordinary through death. The symbols may have helped the living place those dead into an ordered memory. A carved stone does not remove grief, but it gives grief a form. It says, this person must not vanish completely. It says, here is a mark strong enough to outlast us. That may be why undeciphered symbols feel so moving. We cannot read them, but we can understand the desire behind them. Humans have always wanted memory to survive. We carve names in stone, press hands into wet cement, write initials on trees, save photographs, keep locks of hair, maintain graves, build monuments, and occasionally label leftovers in the refrigerator with a level of seriousness that suggests deep territorial instinct. The scale changes, but the impulse remains. Tiya's stelae are part of that impulse. They're a durable attempt to keep meaning present after the people who made it are gone. The tragedy, or perhaps the beauty, is that the stone succeeded and failed at the same time. They survived. The meaning became uncertain. The message reached us, but not in translation. As night settles around the idea of Tiya, the stones become less like a puzzle to solve quickly, and more like a reminder of how much history exists between evidence and understanding. We can count the monuments, we can record the carvings, we can excavate graves, we can compare symbols across regions, we can propose date ranges, we can protect the site. But we cannot yet sit beside one of those stones and say with complete confidence, this sword means this sign means that, this person was remembered in exactly this way. The gap remains, and in that gap the larger question waits with unusual patience. If we cannot fully read the symbols, and if dating nearby materials does not always tell us when a stone tradition first began, how confidently can we say that any one monument belongs only to the people whose remains happen to be found beside it? How often are we dating the final use of a place, rather than its first importance? How often are we naming the last visible builders, while the first ones remain deeper in the ground, or deeper still in traditions no longer spoken aloud? That question does not stay at Tiya. It follows us back to every stone we have visited. The fallen giants of Aksum, the fitted walls of Yeha, the dense ridges of Gedeo, the carved stelae of Tiya, all of them depend on how we decide what a date really dates. A burial, a charcoal layer, a construction phase, a repair, a reuse, a ritual deposit, a cultural habit, a stone's first shaping, a landscape's first sacredness. These are not the same thing, though they are often tangled together. And so the next step in the story is not another monument, but the method itself, the quiet scientific problem beneath so many confident timelines. When we date what lies near the stone, are we always dating the stone, or only one moment in its much longer life? The problem with ancient stone is that it looks as though it should be honest. Wood rots, cloth frays, names disappear, bones become fragile, and pottery breaks into the sort of pieces that make archaeologists both excited and quietly resentful. But stone seems different. Stone feels permanent. It stands there with the calm expression of something that has seen every argument already, and does not intend to join in. So when we look at the stelae of Aksum, the walls of Yeha, the dense megalithic fields of Gedeo, or the carved stones of Tiya, it is tempting to imagine that the stones themselves carry their dates inside them, like a little geological label saying, made by humans here, in this year, under these circumstances, please file appropriately. Sadly, stones are not so courteous. This is where one of the quietest but most important problems in archaeology begins. We often cannot directly date the moment when a stone was first quarried, shaped, moved, raised, carved, reused, or understood as sacred. We can date things around it. We can date charcoal in a nearby hearth. We can date bone from a burial. We can date seeds, wood, plant fibres, or organic residue from a sealed layer. We can sometimes date sediments that buried or surrounded it. But the stone itself is usually older than human history, sometimes millions of years older, because it began as geology long before any person decided it should become a monument. Radiocarbon dating, the method most people casually call carbon dating, works on organic materials, not on plain stone. Oxford's radiocarbon lab describes it as applicable to most organic materials over roughly the last 50,000 years, while UChicago explains that carbon-14 dating works on organic materials and has its own material and age limits. That sounds simple enough, but it changes everything. If you find charcoal beneath a standing stone and radiocarbon date it, you have dated the charcoal. If you find a human bone in a grave beside a stelae, you have dated the person, or more precisely the death of the organism whose remains produced the sample. If you find burned seeds in a layer associated with a monument, you have dated the seeds. These dates may be extremely useful. They may be the best evidence available. They may place the monument within a strong archaeological context. But they are still dates of associated material, not automatically the date when the stone first became a monument. This distinction is not a loophole for wild speculation. It is a basic rule of evidence. Archaeological dates are only as good as the relationship between the sample and the thing we're trying to understand. Beta Analytic, a radiocarbon laboratory, puts this very plainly when it says the sample-context relationship must be established before carbon dating can produce a meaningful archaeological result. Context is the small word doing the heavy lifting here. A date without context is like finding a receipt in a coat pocket and assuming it proves when the coat was made. It may tell you when someone bought soup. It may tell you when the coat was worn. It may tell you that the owner had strong feelings about lentils, but it does not necessarily date the coat. Archaeology works with similar caution. A piece of charcoal found under a stone might come from the fire used during the monument's construction, or it might come from an earlier hearth already in the soil before the stone was raised, or it might have been carried in by later disturbance, or it might come from wood that was already old when burned. A bone in a grave might date a burial beneath a stone, but if the stone was reused from an older site, or if an older standing stone was adopted as a grave marker later, then the burial does not date the first life of the stone. This is not a reason to reject dating. It is a reason to read dates carefully, the way one reads a sleepy recipe written in someone else's handwriting. This matters especially for megaliths because large stones can have long lives. A potsherd tends to remain close to the moment when it broke, unless someone moves it. A seed is usually a short-lived object. A bone belongs to a living body from a particular time. But a standing stone can be part of one ritual system, fall over, be raised again, be moved, be carved later, be incorporated into a burial, become a boundary marker, become a sacred object, and then be protected by people who no longer remember why it was first set up. A stone may be old as a rock, later as a quarry block, later still as a shaped monument, and later again as a symbol in a new cultural setting. Which of those ages are we asking about? The geological age, the quarrying age, the carving age, the first erection, the last erection, the burial beside it, the ritual layer around it, the moment when local people began to revere it? Each question can have a different answer. This is one reason Ethiopia's megaliths invite such careful thought. At Aksum, the royal stelae are connected to tombs and a powerful kingdom, and that association is meaningful. But if a date comes from the tomb, it dates the tomb use, not necessarily the first development of the upright stone tradition that made such monuments culturally meaningful. At Yeha, the Great Temple's masonry belongs to a known early 1st millennium BCE architectural world, but that date does not automatically tell us when local builders first learned the habits, quarrying techniques, or sacred building practices that made such a structure possible. At Gedeo, the dating of certain stelae sites can establish periods of use, but thousands of stones across a living landscape suggest traditions with beginnings and transformations that may be older than any one dated sample. At Tiya, burials and associated materials help place the cemetery in time, but the carved signs may have belonged to a visual vocabulary with deeper roots. In all of these places, dates are not useless. They are anchors. But an anchor is not the entire ship. Archaeologists know this. Serious researchers do not simply toss a bone into a machine, receive a date, and then declare the entire landscape solved before tea. They examine stratigraphy, the order of layers. They study whether the sample was sealed, disturbed, intrusive, or clearly connected to the monument. They compare pottery styles, tool marks, inscriptions, architecture, environmental evidence, burial position, soil formation, and other dates from the same site. Good archaeology is not one date. It is a conversation among many forms of evidence, some of which agree politely, some of which disagree in ways that make everyone reach for more coffee. A Cambridge paper on archaeological radiocarbon dating emphasises that many dates come from charred material and bone, but that insecure context can be a problem, which is why the material in its archaeological context must be evaluated with care. This is also why the phrase carbon-dated stones is usually misleading. It appears often in popular conversations, sometimes with great confidence and occasionally with dramatic background music. But unless there is organic material in or on the stone, or unless the stone has some special datable component, ordinary carbon dating does not date the stone itself. It dates carbon-bearing material associated with the stone. The difference is small in wording and enormous in meaning. If someone says, the monument was carbon dated to the 10th century, the careful question is, what exactly was dated? Charcoal in the fill, bone from a grave, organic residue from a surface, wood from a structure, a seed from a sealed layer. And was that material securely related to the construction, use, repair, or abandonment of the monument? Without those details, a date can sound much more direct than it is. There are methods that can sometimes get closer to dating stone or stone-related events, but they are not magic buttons either. Optically stimulated luminescence, often called OSL, can date the last time certain mineral grains such as quartz or feldspar were exposed to sunlight before being buried. In archaeology, this can be useful for dating sediments around structures, or in some approaches even the burial of stone surfaces, because the trapped energy in mineral grains begins accumulating after exposure to light ends. Science. Direct overview describes OSL as estimating the time since quartz or feldspar grains were last exposed to sunlight, while research on stone surfaces has explored using OSL to date when a stone surface was last exposed before construction buried it. That sounds promising, and it is. But it still requires the right conditions. If the sediment was not fully exposed to sunlight before burial, the luminescent signal may not have been properly reset. If the sample is disturbed, the date may not reflect the event we want. If the stone surface was exposed, buried, exposed again, moved or reused, interpretation becomes difficult. OSL can be powerful, but like all tools, it answers the question its physics allows it to answer, not necessarily the question a documentary narrator would like it to answer while pointing meaningfully at a sunset. It may tell us when sediment was last exposed to light, or when a surface was buried, but it still needs context to connect that date to human action. Cosmogenic nuclide dating is another method that can sometimes date how long rock surfaces have been exposed at Earth's surface. Cosmic rays interact with minerals and produce rare isotopes, and their accumulation can be used to estimate exposure ages. The USGS describes cosmogenic nuclides such as helium-3, beryllium-10, carbon-14, neon-21, aluminum-26 and chlorine-36 as tools that can date landforms and measure erosion rates. This is fascinating, especially for geological surfaces, glacial landscapes and exposed rock. But again, translating that into the age of a human-made megalith is not always straightforward. A stone might have been exposed in a quarry before being moved. It might have inherited a cosmogenic signal from earlier exposure. It might have been buried and re-exposed. It might have weathered unevenly. The date may tell us how long a surface was exposed, but not always when a person carved a symbol into it, dragged it to a ridge, or decided it represented an ancestor. So the problem is not that science cannot help us date stones. It can. The problem is that each dating method has a target. Radiocarbon dates once living material. OSL dates light exposure or burial histories of mineral grains. Cosmogenic methods date surface exposure under particular assumptions. Pottery typology dates styles by comparison. Inscriptions date texts if we can read them and place the script historically. Stratigraphy dates relationships between layers. None of these methods simply whispers, "This stone's human story began here," unless the evidence is unusually kind. And evidence as a rule is not always kind. It is often fragmentary, damp, reused, chewed by animals, disturbed by roots, robbed by later builders, or found just slightly out of place enough to cause professional frowning. This is why dating a megalithic tradition is harder than dating a single event. A tradition is not a moment. It is a habit repeated through time. The first person to raise a stone may leave no trace that survives. The second generation may raise better stones. The fifth may carve symbols. The 10th may reuse older stones in graves. The 20th may revere the whole field as ancestral without knowing who began it. Archaeologists may then date the latest burial and quite correctly say the burial belongs to that period. But the tradition behind the stone may have begun earlier, sometimes much earlier. Not because anyone is hiding the truth, but because culture leaves uneven traces. The beginning of a practice is often smaller, less durable, or buried under its later success. This is particularly important when thinking about Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo, and Tiya together. Each place has a visible phase that can be studied. Aksum's royal monuments belong to a powerful kingdom. Yeha's great temple belongs to a known early monumental architectural horizon. Gedeo's stelae belong to a broader southern Ethiopian megalithic landscape. Tiya's carved stones belong to a funerary site with graves. But visible phases are not necessarily beginnings. They may be peaks, transformations, revivals, or final expressions. The earliest surviving evidence of a tradition is not always the birth of the tradition. It is only the earliest evidence we currently have. That sentence is not as exciting as lost empire discovered, but it is far more useful and, in its quiet way, more mysterious, more... Consider how ordinary this is in daily life. Imagine walking into an old house and seeing a family ritual. Every year a candle is placed in a window on a certain night. You ask when the candle holder was made. Someone says 1963. You ask when the table beneath it was made. Someone says 1890. You find a photograph showing the same ritual in 1912. Then an elder tells you their grandmother said it was already old when she was a child. Which date is the date of the tradition? The candle holder, the table, the photograph, the memory, the first time someone lit that candle? All are true, but none alone is complete. Megalithic landscapes work in a similar way, except the candle holder weighs several tons and has been rained on for centuries. This is also why reuse is such a serious issue. Ancient people reused stone constantly. Stone is valuable. It takes labour to quarry and shape. If an older monument falls, later people may cut it into building blocks, re-erect it, carve new symbols, incorporate it into a wall, or place it over a new grave. Reuse is not disrespect by default. It can be practical, sacred, political, or symbolic. A later ruler might reuse an older stone to claim ancestry. A community might reuse a sacred marker, because the old power of the stone is precisely what makes it valuable. A farmer might move a stone because it is in the way, though hopefully after thinking carefully and perhaps after being warned by an elder not to annoy anyone ancestral. Reuse means that the stone's last context may not be its first. If we date only the last context, we may miss the earlier lives. There is also the problem of disturbance. Sites do not remain sealed forever. Burials are reopened, Tombs are robbed, roots penetrate layers, animals burrow, earthquakes shift stones. Later rituals dig into older deposits. Conservation work may move material. Erosion exposes and removes sediments. Farmers cultivate around stones for generations. A sample found near a megalith may not have begun there. This does not make all evidence useless. Archaeologists have methods for recognizing disturbance. But it does mean that every sample must be understood in its formation history. How did it get there? Was it sealed? Was it mixed? Does it belong to the same phase as the monument? Could it be residual, meaning older material redeposited in a later layer? Could it be intrusive, meaning later material that entered an older layer? The language is technical, but the idea is simple. Things move. Soil is not a filing cabinet. The old wood problem is another lovely inconvenience. If charcoal comes from a long-lived tree, the radiocarbon date may reflect when the tree grew, not when it was burned. A wooden beam cut from the heartwood of an old tree can appear older than the construction that used it. If old timber was reused, the problem grows. Short-lived materials such as seeds are often better for dating specific events, because they usually grew close to the time they were deposited. But they must still be securely connected to the event. A burned seed in a sealed construction layer is excellent. A random bit of charcoal from loose soil nearby is less convincing. Archaeology is full of these quiet preferences. It likes samples that behave well. Unfortunately, ancient sites were not arranged by people thinking, let us preserve only short-lived botanical remains in sealed contexts for the convenience of future chronologists. When we apply all this to Ethiopia's megaliths, the older civilization question becomes more disciplined. It is not enough to say, the stones look too advanced, so they must be older. That is not a good argument. Human beings have been capable of remarkable engineering, symbolic thought, and social organization for a very long time. The builders of Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo, and Tiya do not need to be rescued by imaginary predecessors to be impressive. But it is also too simple to say, we dated something nearby, therefore every aspect of the stone tradition began exactly then. A careful view leaves room for inherited knowledge. It says the visible monuments may belong to the societies we name, while the skills, meanings, sacred places, and symbolic habits behind them may reach further back. This is not a rejection of archaeology. It is archaeology doing what it does best, separating what is known from what is assumed. The strongest argument for older layers is not usually a single misdated stone. It is pattern. Aksum shows monumental funerary stone on a royal scale. Yeha shows precise stone architecture centuries earlier in the north. Gedeo shows enormous numbers of standing stones across a cultural landscape in the south. Tiya shows carved symbols in a funerary setting that remain difficult to read. These are not identical traditions, and they should not be forced into one. But together they suggest that Ethiopia's relationship with stone was broad, long-lasting, and regionally varied. That kind of diversity often points to deep roots. Not one secret blueprint, but many local histories of stone, memory, burial, sacredness, and social power. The stones may be different branches of a tree whose roots are still partly underground. And that underground part is where caution and wonder meet. A date can tell us when one event likely happened. It can narrow possibilities. It can disprove fantasies. It can anchor stories to evidence. But it cannot always explain why a society chose stone in the first place, how technical knowledge was passed down, how a symbol developed, or how long a sacred landscape remained important before the first datable material was deposited. Those questions require archaeology, yes, but also anthropology, oral tradition, landscape study, geology, conservation, and humility, especially humility. Ancient stone has a way of making confident people look a little silly if they speak too quickly. It has had a long time to prepare, so when someone asks, how old are Ethiopia's megaliths really? The most honest answer may sound less dramatic than expected. Some are dated by associated materials and archaeological contexts. Some belong strongly to known historical societies. Some traditions appear to reach back before the Common Era. Some sites were reused, reinterpreted, or preserved into later periods. The stones themselves may not always give direct dates, and the ideas behind them may be older than the surviving monuments we can confidently place. This answer does not close the mystery. It gives it a proper foundation. A mystery without method is just fog. A mystery with method becomes a landscape we can walk through slowly, noticing where the ground is firm and where it softens beneath us. That is why the dating problem is not a distraction from the monuments. It is central to them. To understand Aksum's granite giants, Yeha's walls, Gedeo's standing stones and Tiya's carved symbols, we must ask not only what dates we have, but what those dates actually date. Are we dating construction, use, burial, repair, abandonment, reuse, reverence, or merely a nearby event? Are we seeing the beginning of a tradition, or one of its later expressions? Are we naming the builders of a monument while overlooking the teachers of the technique? Are we mistaking the surviving chapter for the first page? These questions do not weaken the story, they make it more interesting. And from here, the stones begin to suggest something more subtle than a simple lost civilization hidden beneath all official history. They suggest inheritance. They suggest knowledge passed from hand to hand, perhaps without writing. Sacred places remembered through practice. Building techniques refined over generations. Symbols copied after their earliest meanings had shifted. Communities arriving at already important places and making them important again. This is how the past often survives, not as a sealed treasure chest waiting to be opened, but as a series of habits carried forward until the origins blur. The next question, then, is not only whether Ethiopia's monuments are older than they seem, but whether the people who built them were drawing from a deep reservoir of knowledge whose earlier sources have slipped beyond the reach of easy dating. Once we admit that a date found near a stone is not always the same thing as the first moment that stone mattered, the whole Ethiopian landscape begins to feel deeper. Not necessarily stranger in the noisy sense, not as if every hill is suddenly hiding a lost city with golden roofs and an unusually advanced municipal drainage department, but deeper in the quieter archaeological sense. The visible monument may be only the last clear sentence in a much longer conversation. The stone we see may belong to Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo, or Tiya in its final known form, but the knowledge that made it possible may have travelled through hands, rituals, roots, and memories long before anyone carved a royal facade, fitted a dry wall, raised a ridge marker, or cut a sword into stone. This is the idea of inherited knowledge, and it is less dramatic than a single lost empire, but in many ways more interesting. It does not ask us to imagine that later Ethiopian civilizations were unable to build their own monuments. Quite the opposite. It asks us to imagine that they were part of a long chain of skill, memory, and sacred practice, and that some of the most impressive achievements in stone may have been built by people who had inherited far more than we can now easily see. A civilization never begins at the moment it becomes visible to historians. That is one of the small traps of written history. We tend to start where names appear, where inscriptions become legible, where coins are minted, where kings announce themselves, where outsiders mention a place, or where buildings become large enough to survive. But people were living, trading, worshipping, burying, building, farming, and experimenting long before their societies became easy for us to label. Aksum did not rise from emptiness. Yeha did not become a major highland centre because someone suddenly discovered that stones could be stacked neatly. Gedeo's megalithic landscape did not become dense with standing stones because one generation had a sudden collective urge to decorate ridgelines. Tiya's carved symbols did not appear in a cultural vacuum, unrelated to any older habit of marking the dead or speaking through signs. The named civilizations are known communities of the visible peaks. Beneath them are older slopes, earlier settlements, forgotten specialists, unnamed ancestors, and traditions that may have been so familiar to the people who used them that no one thought to explain them for our benefit. This is not a rejection of the established sites and dates. Aksum's major stelae are strongly connected to the Aksumite kingdom, and UNESCO describes several surviving examples as dating between the 3rd and 4th centuries, with the largest fallen monolith around 33 metres long and the tallest standing example rising over 23 metres. Yeha's Great Temple is usually placed much earlier, around the 7th century BCE, and UNESCO describes it as a hilltop building made in dry masonry from large dressed blocks, surviving to about 14 metres high. Gedeo is recognised not only for megaliths, but as a living cultural landscape of agroforestry, sacred forests, and long-standing indigenous tradition. Tiya contains 36 monuments, including 32 carved stelae with symbols that remain difficult to decipher, and UNESCO describes them as remains of an ancient Ethiopian culture whose age has not yet been precisely determined. These facts matter. They give the stones their immediate historical homes, but a home is not always a birthplace. A monument can belong to a later culture while still preserving older ideas, older skills, or older sacred geography. That is where the shadow of an older world begins to appear. Inherited knowledge is usually not spectacular when it is being passed on. It often looks like ordinary work. A mason shows a younger mason how a block must be dressed so that its weight settles correctly. A quarry worker knows which stone splits cleanly and which stone will betray you halfway through the job, which is a deeply inconvenient personality trait for a rock. An elder explains where a stone may be raised and where it must not be raised. A ritual specialist knows which words are spoken before a grave is closed. A builder knows how to align a wall not because he has read a manual, but because his teacher knew, and his teacher's teacher knew. A community knows that certain ridges, groves, tombs, or old stones are not ordinary places. No one needs to write this down for it to be powerful. In many societies, the most durable forms of knowledge are carried by practice, and practice can survive political change, religious change, and even the loss of names. This matters because the monuments we have been following all suggest organisation beyond the individual. Aksum's stelae required quarrying, transport, carving, and the coordination of enormous labour. Yeha's walls required precision stone dressing and stable dry masonry. Gedeo's thousands of stones required repeated acts of selection, movement and emplacement across generations. Tiya's symbols required a shared visual vocabulary, whether or not that vocabulary counts as writing. None of these achievements can be reduced to one clever person having a bright idea after a good breakfast. They required communities of knowledge. They required specialists. They required people who knew not only how to make stone stand, but why standing stone mattered, and that why may be older than the surviving monuments. Consider Aksum again, but not from the royal side first. Imagine smaller stones before the great stelae, rougher markers, local burial places, upright stones raised for families, chiefs, ancestors, or ritual purposes before royal power turned the form into something monumental. The Aksumite kings may have taken an existing vocabulary of stone and enlarged it until it became unmistakably royal. This is a common pattern. Powerful states often do not invent symbols from nothing. They take symbols people already understand and make them larger, costlier, more permanent and more controlled. A local marker becomes a royal monument. A burial custom becomes an elite necropolis. A familiar form becomes propaganda in granite. If this happened at Aksum, it does not diminish Aksumite achievement. It shows political intelligence. The rulers understood that inherited symbols carry authority precisely because people already feel their weight. This way of thinking also helps explain why the largest Aksumite stelae are so excessive. A grave marker does not need to be over 20 metres high to identify a burial. A stone that tall is doing something more than labelling. It is amplifying. It is taking a cultural form and stretching it into public power. It says that the person below, or the authority that placed the stone there, belongs to a scale beyond ordinary life. but amplification works best when the audience already understands the basic message. If upright stone had older associations with death, ancestry, sacred presence, or social memory, then the Aksumite rulers did not have to explain the meaning from the beginning. They only had to make it impossible to ignore. It is rather like speaking through a megaphone. The megaphone is impressive, but the language must already exist. Yeha offers a different kind of inheritance. There, the question is not the enlargement of a burial marker, but the arrival of precise stone architecture in a highland context already shaped by local settlement and cross-Red Sea exchange. The Great Temple's dry masonry and dressed stone blocks are often discussed in relation to South Arabian connections, and that is reasonable. The ancient Red Sea was not a wall, it was a route. People, goods, scripts, religious ideas, building styles and political forms moved across it. But even if architectural ideas came through contact, the making of Yeha still depended on local mastery. Influence may carry an idea, but it does not dress a stone block. It does not prepare a foundation. It does not feed workers. It does not decide how a temple should sit on a hilltop in an Ethiopian landscape. The building required local adaptation, and adaptation requires knowledge already present or rapidly developed through apprenticeship. Here the older world may not be a vanished empire, but a local technical background that we only glimpse when it becomes monumental. Earlier buildings may have used wood, mud, smaller stone, or mixed materials that did not survive as dramatically as the Great Temple. Smaller sacred structures may have existed before the temple. Quarries may have been known before royal or religious authorities commissioned major construction. Skilled workers may have developed their craft over generations before their work reached the scale that now attracts world attention. When archaeology finds the grand stone building, we may be seeing the moment a tradition became durable, not the moment it began. The earliest permanent survivor is not always the first attempt. It is simply the one that endured. Gedeo makes inherited knowledge visible through repetition. In a landscape with dense clusters of megalithic monuments, knowledge must have moved across time in a very practical way. One generation learned where stones belonged, another learned how they were shaped or selected, another learned how ceremonies were performed around them, another kept certain places protected, perhaps even after the earliest meanings had changed. UNESCO describes Gedeo not merely as a fossil landscape of old monuments, but as a long-standing living cultural tradition involving agroforestry and sacred forests. That matters because living landscapes often preserve older structures of thought, even when the first explanations become blurred. A sacred grove may remain sacred long after its original founding story changes. A stone may remain protected long after its maker's name disappears. A ridge may remain a place of ritual because generations keep treating it as such. Inheritance is not always a clean handover of exact information. Sometimes it is a continuity of behaviour. That kind of continuity is easy to underestimate. Modern people often imagine knowledge as something stored in books, databases, schools and archives, but many ancient societies stored knowledge in repeated action. You knew the law because the elders recited it. You knew the boundary because the community walked it. You knew the sacred place because no one cut trees there. You knew the correct stone because people before you had used that stone. You knew what to do for the dead because you had seen it done. This kind of knowledge can last a very long time, but it changes as it lasts. Details fall away. New meanings attach themselves. A ritual that began for one reason may continue for another. A stone raised by one group may be revered by a later group. A symbol may be copied long after its first meaning is no longer fully understood. This is not ignorance. It is how culture survives without freezing. Tiya brings that problem into sharp focus because the symbols are visible but not fully readable. UNESCO's description of the site emphasises that most of the carved symbols are difficult to decipher. That means we can see the signs but not confidently enter the mental world that produced them. The carvings may have marked graves, status, weapons, achievements, lineages, ritual roles, or categories no longer available to us. But if the symbols were inherited from older traditions, then even the people who carved them may have been working with meanings that had already shifted. This happens in many cultures. Forms last longer than explanations. People continue to use an emblem, gesture, phrase, or ceremony because it is important, even if its origin is debated, forgotten, or retold in several different ways. Tiya's symbols may therefore represent not only a lost code, but a long-lived code whose earlier layers were already ancient by the time the surviving stones were carved. This possibility is especially important when thinking about the phrase forgotten civilization. It is easy to picture a forgotten civilization as something dramatic and singular. One people, one capital, one sudden disappearance, one set of monuments left behind like a riddle. But the past is often more complicated. A forgotten civilization may not be a kingdom with walls and banners. It may be a network of communities. It may be a ritual tradition spread across regions. It may be a class of stoneworkers whose names were never recorded. It may be a set of sacred places older than the political systems that later claimed them. It may be a way of organising death, land, ancestry and authority that continued under different names. In that sense, an older world can cast a shadow without leaving a single obvious ruin at its centre. The shadow is visible in skills that seem already mature when they first appear clearly. It is visible in symbols that appear meaningful but resist translation. It is visible in landscapes where stones cluster around ridges and sacred places rather than appearing as isolated accidents. It is visible in the way later societies build on earlier ones without always preserving their names. Aksum's royal monuments may be Aksumite, but their cultural force may depend on older stonemarking practices. Yeha's temple may belong to a 1st millennium BCE religious and political centre, but its builders may have drawn on earlier local knowledge and cross-cultural technical exchange. Gedeo's stones may belong to a living indigenous landscape, while also carrying older layers of ritual geography. Tiya's carved stelae may mark a cemetery from a known broad period, while preserving signs whose deeper roots are still uncertain. The older world is not necessarily beneath one site. It may be distributed across all of them as habit, memory, technique, and meaning. This is also how real human inheritance works. We rarely receive the past whole. We receive pieces, a story, a tool, a ceremony, a family rule, a building method, a route through hills, a warning about a place, a shape that must be carved a certain way. We may not know why everything is done as it is done, but we know that it matters. Over time, those pieces can be rearranged. A new religion may reinterpret an old sacred site. A new kingdom may make an old symbol royal. A new community may adopt older stones as ancestors. A new burial tradition may use a landscape already marked by memory. The result is not a clean replacement of one civilization by another. It is layering. And Ethiopia's megaliths, perhaps more than anything else, are monuments of layering. Layering can confuse modern timelines because timelines prefer clean beginnings and endings. A kingdom begins here. A temple is built then. A cemetery is used between these centuries. A culture flourishes, declines, and disappears. These categories are necessary, but they can make the past look more organised than it felt to the people living inside it. A farmer in an ancient landscape might not think, I am living during the late phase of a pre-Aksumite cultural horizon. He might think the rains are late, the goats are troublesome, the old stone on the ridge must not be disturbed, and the elders say this road has always been used. Historical periods are tools for us. Inheritance is what people actually live with. The idea of inherited knowledge also protects us from two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is to underestimate ancient Ethiopian societies by assuming they could not have achieved major stonework without outside help, or a mysterious lost master civilization. That is wrong. The evidence from Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo and Tiya shows local capacity, social organisation and technical skill in several forms. The second mistake is to imagine that because a monument belongs to a known society, Everything behind it began with that society. That is also too simple. Known civilizations inherit from lesser-known ones. Named kingdoms grow from unnamed communities. Monumental traditions often have pre-monumental roots. The careful position is not that later builders were incapable, but that they were heirs. Being an heir is powerful. It means receiving something and changing it. It means taking an old form and making it do new work. The Aksumite rulers may have inherited the idea that upright stone could speak for the dead, then turned that idea into towering carved architecture. The builders of Yeha may have inherited local stone knowledge and combined it with imported architectural ideas to create something both connected and distinct. Communities in Gedeo may have inherited sacred landscapes and continued to mark them with stones over long periods. The people of Tiya may have inherited symbols whose meanings were shared in their world, but are now difficult for ours to recover. In each case, inheritance does not reduce creativity. It makes creativity possible. There is a practical side to this too. Skilled stonework depends on accumulated error. That may not sound elegant, but it is true. Someone learns where a stone cracks because someone else once cracked one. Someone learns how thick a wall must be because a thinner one failed. Someone learns how to raise a standing stone because an earlier attempt leaned, split, slipped, or fell in a way that everyone remembered with great seriousness and perhaps a few unhelpful remarks from bystanders. Technical knowledge is built from success and failure. The fallen great stelae at Aksum is a reminder that even highly organised builders could push beyond safe limits. But that kind of ambitious failure only happens in a tradition that already knows a great deal. You do not attempt an enormous monolith as your first experiment unless your planning committee has been dangerously overconfident. This accumulation of knowledge may leave little direct trace. Archaeologists can find tools, quarries, unfinished stones, workshops, chips from carving, transport routes, and construction layers if they survive and are recognised. But much of the knowledge was embodied. It existed in muscles, habits, judgments, and spoken instruction. It vanished when specialists died unless others had learned it. This is why the monuments are precious. They are the hard remainder of soft knowledge. The stones preserve the outcome, while the gestures that made them are gone. We can see the wall, but not the hand correcting the block. We can see the stelae, but not the rope team adjusting tension. We can see the carved symbol, but not the elder explaining who was allowed to carve it. The absence of those people is what creates the shadow. And there is another kind of inheritance beneath the technical one, sacred geography. Some places become important before they are monumentalized. A spring, ridge, grove, hilltop, cave, or burial area may gather significance through repeated use. Later builders then make that significance visible in stone. If we date the stone, we date the visible marking, not necessarily the beginning of the place's importance. This may be especially relevant in landscapes like Gedeo, where sacred forests and megalithic monuments coexist within a living cultural system. It may also matter at Tiya, where a cemetery could have been established in a place already meaningful, for reasons not preserved in the excavated record. The stone is sometimes not the origin of sacredness, it is the announcement of it. So when we speak of the shadow of an older world, we should imagine something subtle. Not a hidden race of builders replacing known Ethiopians, and not a single lost kingdom responsible for every mystery. Imagine instead earlier communities whose names are gone but whose practices endured. Imagine local builders teaching techniques that later states made monumental. Imagine sacred places reoccupied and reinterpreted. Imagine symbols copied across generations until their meanings shifted. Imagine burial landscapes used, abandoned, remembered, and used again. Imagine a long chain in which each society believed it was acting in the present, while carrying more of the past than it could fully name. That is how history often works. The forgotten world is not always buried under the known one. Sometimes it is inside it. This possibility gives Ethiopia's megaliths their particular power. They do not merely challenge the mainstream timeline by demanding that every date be moved backward. That would be too blunt. They challenge it by asking what a timeline is capable of showing. A timeline can mark construction phases. It can arrange sites in order. It can connect monuments with political periods and cultural horizons. But it struggles with inheritance because inheritance is not a single date. It is a process. The moment a technique is learned, the moment it is first used, the moment it becomes traditional, the moment it is made royal, the moment it is reused, the moment it is forgotten, and the moment it is rediscovered can all be different. Stones can sit at the crossing of all those moments, and once we understand that, the older world idea becomes less about proving one astonishing claim and more about listening for continuity. The Aksumite stelae, Yeha's walls, Gedeo's standing stones, and Tiya's symbols may each belong to their known contexts, while also pointing beyond them. They may preserve in granite dressed masonry, ridge markers, and carved signs, the remains of knowledge that passed through people whose names were never written down. This knowledge may not have been secret. It may have been ordinary to those who held it. That is the strange thing about forgotten knowledge. It is not always hidden because someone concealed it. Sometimes it is hidden because everyone once knew it, and no one thought it needed explaining. So the stones leave us with a slower and more human mystery. Who are the teachers behind the visible builders? Who first showed later communities how to make stone speak for the dead, how to fit blocks without mortar, how to organise ridge landscapes around standing monuments, how to carve signs that carried identity into the grave? Were they ancestors remembered under other names? Earlier communities absorbed into later kingdoms? Specialists whose craft outlived their language? Ritual groups whose authority did not depend on royal inscriptions? The record does not yet give us a single answer, but it gives us enough to suspect that the famous civilizations were not the first voices in the room. They may have been the loudest voices to survive, and from there the story begins to move beneath the names themselves, beneath Aksum, before the royal monuments, beneath Yeha, before the temple walls, beneath Gedeo's living traditions, into older sacred uses of the land, beneath Tiya's carved signs, toward the people whose symbols remain visible but unread. The question is no longer only whether Ethiopia's megaliths are older than they seem. It is whether the builders we can name were standing on foundations laid by people we cannot, and whether those forgotten builders are still present, not as ghosts in the dramatic sense, but as habits, techniques, and memories locked into stone. Beneath every recorded kingdom there are people whose names do not survive. That is one of history's quietest facts, and perhaps one of its saddest. We remember rulers because rulers had monuments, coins, inscriptions, armies, priests, scribes, and occasionally a very healthy sense of their own importance. We remember capitals because cities leave walls, roads, tombs, temples, and layers of broken pottery. We remember kingdoms because kingdoms arrange the world loudly enough to be noticed. But under that loudness, there are always others. Farmers who prepared the food that fed the builders, quarry workers who knew where the stone would split, carvers who learned the right pressure of the tool, haulers who understood ropes, slopes, mud, and the particular stubbornness of a block that did not want to move, ritual specialists who knew which place was sacred before any king claimed it, elders who remembered old boundaries, families who buried their dead according to rules older than the latest ruler's name. These are the forgotten builders beneath recorded kingdoms, and when we look at Ethiopia's megaliths, it may be their hands we are partly seeing. Recorded history naturally favours the moment when a society becomes visible in recognisable ways. Aksum appears as a kingdom, with trade, power, coins, inscriptions, royal tombs, and enormous stelae. UNESCO describes Aksum's archaeological remains as including several stelae from the 3rd and 4th centuries, with the largest standing example over 23 metres high and the largest fallen monolith about 33 metres long. Yeha appears earlier, with its great temple, palace remains and rock-cut tombs, a site whose monumental stone architecture is placed in the early 1st millennium BCE and whose dressed blocks were laid without mortar. Gedeo appears as a cultural landscape where sacred forests, cultivated slopes, and dense megalithic clusters are bound together through living traditions and elder care. Tiya appears as a cemetery of carved stelae, 36 monuments in all, including 32 with symbols that UNESCO says are difficult to decipher, the remains of an ancient Ethiopian culture whose age has not been precisely determined. These are the visible points on the map. They are real, studied, and important. But a map is not the ground. It marks what we can name, not everything that was there. The deeper question is what came before those names became convenient. Before Aksum was Aksum, what communities lived in the highlands? Before Yeha's temple stood on its hill, what local builders, traders, and ritual groups already knew the landscape? Before Gedeo's stones became part of a recognised cultural landscape, how many generations had marked ridges, protected forests, and treated certain places as more than ordinary ground? Before Tiya's symbols were carved into stone, how long had people used signs, weapons, grave markers, and ritual forms to speak about the dead? Recorded kingdoms often inherit more than they invent. They inherit people, they inherit places, they inherit roads, they inherit old sacredness, they inherit methods of building, they inherit expectations about how power should look and how memory should stand, and because the inheritors are often the ones who leave the clearest monuments, we can mistake them for the beginning of the story. This is not unique to Ethiopia. It is how human history usually works. Rome inherited from Etruscans, Greeks, Latins, and countless unnamed Italian communities. Medieval churches reused Roman stones. Islamic cities inherited roads, fortifications, wells, and sacred geographies from earlier worlds. Modern towns sit on older towns, which sit on older paths, which follow older water sources, which were known to people whose names are nowhere in the archive. History is not a series of cleanly separated rooms. It is more like an old house that has been expanded for centuries. A new owner builds a grand entrance, another adds a chapel, another repairs the roof, another turns a storage room into a kitchen, and everyone insists the house is theirs. They are not wrong, but the foundation still belongs to hands they never met. Ethiopia's stone monuments invite us to think in exactly this layered way. The Aksumite stelae may be royal monuments of a powerful kingdom, but they may also represent the grandest surviving expression of older highland traditions of standing stones and elite burial. Yeha's temple may show South Arabian connections and early state formation, but its survival also hints at local skill systems that did not begin with the first block of the Great Temple. Gedeo's standing stones may belong to long local histories of ritual and landscape management, but the sheer density of monuments suggests a tradition with roots deeper than any single dated site. Tiya's carved stelae may belong to a cemetery used in a particular period, but their symbols may draw from a visual language older than the graves we can currently excavate. The recorded world gives us anchors. The forgotten builders give us the rope between them. It helps to imagine the builders not as one hidden civilization, but as many groups of people, some connected, some separate, some remembered indirectly, some lost almost completely. A single lost empire is tempting because it makes the mystery tidy. It gives us one answer, one vanished people, one dramatic explanation. But the real past is rarely so courteous. It is more likely that Ethiopia's megalithic traditions emerged through many communities over long stretches of time. Some may have been chiefdoms or early states. Some may have been ritual groups. Some may have been local lineages. Some may have been specialized craftspeople moving between centers of power. Some may have been communities absorbed into later kingdoms so thoroughly that their names disappeared while their techniques remained. A forgotten builder is not always a vanished king. Sometimes he's a mason's teacher. Sometimes she is the elder who knows where the ancestral stone should stand. Sometimes they are an entire village remembered only through the labour locked into a monument, and labour is the part we should not forget. Ancient monuments often become mysterious because we look at the final object and skip the work. A standing stone seems to have simply appeared. A wall seems to have always been there. A carved symbol seems to float free of the hand that made it. But every stone monument is a record of labour. Someone had to find the material. Someone had to cut it. Someone had to shape it. Someone had to move it through a landscape that was not designed for the convenience of future historians. Someone had to gather workers, feed them, direct them, and perhaps persuade them that this difficult task was not only necessary but meaningful. A large stone is a social object long before it is a monument. It requires cooperation. It requires authority. It requires belief. Without those, it remains geology, and geology is not known for organising itself into cemeteries. The recorded kingdoms are the easiest candidates for such organisation because they had power. Aksumite rulers could command large labour forces. Yeha's elite could support temple building. Communities in Gedeo could maintain ritual landscapes and repeated stone-raising practices. The people of Tiya could invest in carved funerary monuments. But behind every command there is competence. A ruler may say, raise the stone, but someone must know how. A priest may say, build the temple, but someone must judge the foundation. A community may say, mark the dead, but someone must know the form. Power can order labour, but it cannot magically create skill. Skills have lineages of their own. They pass quietly from body to body, from hand to hand, and often leave no name behind. This is especially clear in stonework. Stone is unforgiving. It does not care about royal ambition. It does not bend because a king is impatient. It does not fit neatly because a ritual date is approaching, and everyone has already invited relatives. Stone must be understood. The grain, the fracture, the weight, the balance, the weathering, the sound under the tool, the way a block sits against another block, the way a standing stone settles into a pit. These things are learned through practice. A society capable of major stone monuments must have people who accumulated this knowledge over time. The famous monuments may be the visible work of a kingdom, but the knowledge beneath them may belong to older craft traditions. At Yeha, for instance, the great temple's walling is impressive because it is controlled. Large dressed blocks were placed without mortar, which means the builders relied on the fit, weight, and careful arrangement of stone. That kind of building does not need to be explained by fantasy, but it does need to be explained by training. The person dressing a block had to know the standard expected. The person placing it had to know how tiny errors become large problems higher in the wall. The people planning the structure had to understand height, stability, access, and sacred function. If South Arabian contact influenced the form, local builders still had to make that form real, and local builders do not appear from nowhere. They emerge from earlier traditions, perhaps smaller and less visible, perhaps made partly in wood or mud brick, perhaps represented now only by traces so modest that they do not attract the same awe as a surviving temple wall. Aksum's stelae show a different kind of technical inheritance. The carved faces imitate multi-story architecture, turning a monolith into a symbolic building. That is not just stone cutting, it is translation. The builders took the idea of a structure, with doors, windows, beams, stories and hierarchy, and transferred it onto a single vertical slab. This suggests a society that understood architecture not merely as shelter, but as symbol. Yet before such a form could become royal, the language of stone and burial may have already existed. Smaller stelae, simpler markers, local tomb traditions, and older forms of ancestral memory could all have fed into the royal style. The kingdom made the statement enormous, but perhaps the grammar was already old. The forgotten builders here may not have raised the tallest stelae, but they may have created the conditions under which such stelae made sense. Gedeo offers another version of forgotten builders because the monuments are so numerous and spread through a living landscape. There, one imagines not a single royal workforce but generations of local communities. Different groups may have raised stones for different purposes, in different periods, with different meanings. Some stones may have marked burials. Others may have marked sacred places, social status, ritual events, or ancestral presence. The builders may not have thought of themselves as monument makers in the grand historical sense. They may have thought of themselves as doing what needed to be done for the dead, the land, the elders, the spirits, the lineage, or the community. That is how many deep traditions continue. They are not performed for history. They are performed because life demands them, and at Tiya, the forgotten builders are almost visible through the carvings. The symbols suggest people trained in a shared visual system. A sword carved into stone is not just a doodle. It has placement, form, repetition, and social meaning. The enigmatic signs around it may have been perfectly clear to those who stood before the grave. The carvers, mourners, and relatives may have understood exactly who was being remembered and why the symbols mattered. But the key has gone missing. The people who knew how to read the stones are no longer here to teach us. Their world survives as marks, but not as explanation. In that sense, Tiya's builders are not forgotten because they left nothing. They are forgotten because they left something we have not yet learned to read. This is one of the strange cruelties of the archaeological record. It preserves material and loses meaning. It gives us the stone, but not the conversation. It gives us the grave, but not the grief. It gives us the wall, but not the apprenticeship. It gives us the monument, but not the meeting where someone decided it should be built, probably after a long discussion, and at least one person saying the ancient equivalent of, "Are we quite sure this is necessary?" The builders were real people with real lives, but the surviving evidence turns them into functions. Mason, labourer, ruler, priest, dead person, carver, carrier. We know what they did only in fragments. We rarely know who they were. When we speak of forgotten builders beneath Ethiopia's recorded kingdoms, then, we are also speaking about the limits of fame. A king's name may survive because it was meant to survive. A worker's name may vanish because no one in power thought it needed preserving. But monuments depend more on workers than on names. The stelae of Aksum did not rise because a king wished them upright. They rose because many people made that wish physical. Yeha's walls did not endure because an elite wanted a temple. They endured because builders placed one stone correctly upon another, and another, and another. Gedeo's stones did not multiply because of one decree. They multiplied because communities repeatedly invested labour in memory. Tiya's symbols did not carve themselves because a culture had beliefs. Someone held the tool. Someone knew the sign. Someone cut meaning into stone. There may also have been earlier communities whose achievements were absorbed into later identities. This is common in long-inhabited landscapes. A later kingdom does not always destroy what came before. Often it incorporates it. It uses older routes, settles near older sacred places, claims older tombs, repairs older walls, borrows older symbols, and tells new stories about old stones. Over time, the earlier people disappear as a separate identity, not because they vanish suddenly, but because they became part of something else. Their descendants may have lived under new names. Their sacred sites may have been renamed. Their techniques may have continued in workshops serving new rulers. Their monuments may have been reinterpreted. The result is a deep continuity hidden beneath a change in labels. This is why the phrase "beneath recorded kingdoms" should not be heard only as physically beneath the ground. Some forgotten builders are literally buried under later layers, but others are beneath the historical narrative. They are under the names we use, under Aksumite, under Pre-Aksumite, under DMT, under Gedeo, under ancient Ethiopian culture, under the archaeological categories that help us think but can also make older continuities harder to see. A category is useful, but it is not the whole society. It is a container we create from evidence. Human life spills over the edges. The older world, if we can call it that, may have been made of many overlapping forms of knowledge. There was technical knowledge, how to quarry, shape, transport, fit, and raise stone. There was social knowledge, how to gather labour, who had authority, how obligations were distributed, who could command or request participation. There was ritual knowledge, where stones should stand, what words or offerings were required, how the dead were transformed into ancestors, which places were dangerous or protected. There was landscape knowledge, where water flowed, where ridges were visible, where sacred forests should remain untouched, which routes connected settlements. There was symbolic knowledge, what shapes, weapons, marks and forms meant to those who used them. A recorded kingdom may display this knowledge at its height, but much of it could have been older than the kingdom itself. And if that is true, then Ethiopia's megaliths are not simply monuments of power. They are monuments of transmission. They show knowledge crossing time without always passing through writing. They show that stone can preserve the result of traditions whose instructions were spoken, enacted and embodied. A wall can survive after the building song is forgotten. A stelae can remain after the lineage that raised it changes name. A carved sword can be seen after the social world that made it meaningful has disappeared. A sacred forest can preserve a ritual geography long after outside observers have lost the first story. The past does not always vanish cleanly. Sometimes it leaves behind durable habits, and later people continue them without fully separating old from new. This is also why the lost civilization idea should be handled gently. It is easy to make it too grand, and then it becomes less believable. But if by lost civilization we mean a single hidden superculture that built everything and then disappeared without trace, the evidence does not demand that. If by lost civilization we mean earlier communities, specialists, ritual traditions, sacred geographies, and systems of knowledge whose names are lost but whose influence survived into later monuments, then the idea becomes much more reasonable. It becomes not a claim that history is wrong, but a reminder that history is incomplete. The missing builders do not replace Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo or Tiya. They stand behind them, beneath them, and inside them. The stones themselves seem to encourage this slower interpretation. They do not all point to the same builders, the same time, or the same purpose. They point to recurrence. Again and again in Ethiopia, different communities turned to stone when something needed to last. A king's tomb, a temple wall, a sacred ridge, a grave marker, a symbol for the dead. This recurrence suggests that stone held a special place in social imagination. It was not merely available material, it was chosen for memory, authority, boundary, ancestry, and sacred presence. The forgotten builders may have been the people who first taught later societies that stone could do this kind of work. There is a humility in recognizing them. It keeps us from treating history as only the story of named elites. It reminds us that monuments are collective achievements. It also keeps us from assuming that the first thing we can date is the first thing that happened. Beneath every clear phase there may be earlier practice. Beneath every royal monument there may be village memory. Beneath every temple there may be older sacred ground. Beneath every carved symbol there may be a sign once spoken about around fires, at graves, or in ceremonies we can no longer reconstruct. The stones may be old, but the human web behind them is older and more delicate. Imagine then an unnamed builder in northern Ethiopia long before Aksum's greatest stelae. He knows a certain kind of stone. He learned from someone older. He does not think of himself as part of a lost civilization. He thinks of the task before him. The stone must mark a place. It must stand correctly. The people watching must recognize it. Generations later, another builder works at Yeha, dressing blocks for a temple whose form carries both local and foreign ideas. He too learned from someone. Farther south, a community in Gedeo raises a stelae along a ridge, not as a mystery for us, but as a necessary act for themselves. Later still, at Tiya, a carver cuts a sword and signs into a grave marker, confident that those who need to understand will understand. None of them knows they will become a problem for future dating methods. None of them knows they will be folded into theories about forgotten worlds. They are simply doing the work of memory. That may be the most powerful thing about them. The forgotten builders were not trying to be mysterious. They were trying to make meaning last. And they succeeded, though not completely. The stone lasted. The full meaning did not. What remains is enough to feel the weight of their knowledge, but not enough to speak their names. So we stand with recorded kingdoms in one hand and unnamed inheritance in the other, trying not to drop either. The known societies deserve credit for what they built. The unknown predecessors deserve recognition for what they may have passed on. Between them lies the true depth of Ethiopia's megalithic world. And as the path begins to move toward the final quiet question, the stones seem less like objects waiting for one answer, and more like witnesses to many unfinished ones. Aksum's granite giants, Yeha's mortarless walls, Gedeo's ridges of standing stones, and Tiya's unread signs all suggest that the past is not a clean line of replacement, but a layered field of inheritance. Recorded kingdoms stand in the light because they left stronger traces. Forgotten builders remain in shadow because their names did not. But shadows are not nothing. They show that something once stood there, blocking the light in a shape we can still just make out if we let our eyes adjust. When the timeline goes quiet, the stones do not become silent. They simply stop answering in the way we expect. We want dates, names, kings, builders, dynasties, clear beginnings, clear endings, and a tidy explanation that can be placed neatly on a chart without spilling over the edges. But Ethiopia's megaliths do not always behave like that. They stand in the older manner of things that have survived too much to be simple. Aksum's granite towers, Yeha's fitted walls, Gedeo's ridges of standing stones, and Tiya's carved markers all offer evidence, but not always the kind that leads to one easy conclusion. They do not shout a secret. They do not hand us a finished story. They ask us to slow down and notice what is missing. That may be the real reason these monuments feel so strange. Not because they are impossible, and not because they require some grand hidden civilization to explain them, but because they expose the limits of the stories we can confidently tell. A date can tell us when a burial took place. A wall can tell us that skilled builders worked there. A carved sign can show that a community shared symbols. A field of stones can reveal a long practice of marking land, death, memory, or identity. But behind every answer is another question. Who taught the builders? Who chose the old places? Who decided that stone should carry meaning? How long did the tradition exist before it became visible to us? And how much of the first story had already been forgotten by the time the monuments we see today were raised? The official histories are not meaningless, they are necessary. Aksum was a powerful kingdom. Yeha was an early centre of monumental architecture and ritual authority. Yeo's landscape holds an extraordinary connection between people, farming, sacred forests, and standing stones. Tiya preserves a cemetery of carved stelae with symbols that still resist full explanation. These are not casual guesses. They are the result of excavation, survey, comparison, conservation, and careful scholarship. But careful scholarship also teaches caution. It reminds us that the past is rarely a clean stack of labelled boxes. It is more like old ground after rain, where some stones show clearly, some are partly buried, and some lie just below the surface, felt only when the foot catches them. Aksum's stelae may have been raised by the kingdom whose power made such monuments possible. Yet their very form suggests a tradition already rich enough to be magnified. The great stone towers are not just tall, they are carved as if architecture itself had been turned into memory. False doors, false windows, stacked levels, and careful details turn a single granite slab into a house for the dead, or perhaps a public statement that death didn't end status. Such an idea does not need to have been borrowed from a lost world. It may have grown slowly through local traditions of burial, ancestry, and stone marking. The royal builders of Aksum may have taken a known language and made it monumental. They did not need to invent every word in order to speak powerfully. Sometimes the most effective monument is one that says something old in a scale no one can ignore. Yeha's walls speak differently. They do not rise like stelae or carry undeciphered symbols. They hold. Large dressed blocks, placed without mortar, still convey a builder's confidence across more than 2,000 years. That confidence did not come from nowhere. Even if the temple's form was shaped by contact across the Red Sea, the work had to be done by people who understood the local stone, the hill, the weight, the alignment, and the purpose of the building. A foreign idea cannot build itself. It must become local through labour. It must be translated into the materials and habits of a place. Yeha may therefore preserve not only a moment of early highland state formation, but also a meeting between imported forms and local traditions that were already capable of absorbing them. The stones fit because the society behind them also knew how to fit new ideas into an older landscape. In Gedeo, the whisper is not in one grand monument, but in repetition. Thousands of standing stones across ridges and inhabited slopes suggest that stone was not an occasional gesture. It was a practice repeated enough times to become part of the land's identity. The stones stand among farms, sacred forests, paths, and living communities. They do not feel sealed away from life. They feel woven into it. That makes them harder to interpret, because living landscapes do not freeze their meanings for the convenience of later visitors. A stone may begin as one thing and become another. A ridge may be sacred for one reason, then remembered for another. A monument may be cared for by people who did not raise it but still know that it matters. In Gedeo, the past is not only under the soil, it is in the continued relationship between people and place. Tiya gives the story its sharpest silence. The symbols are there. The swords are there. The carved marks are there. They look deliberate, repeated, and meaningful, yet they remain difficult to read. This is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a language whose speakers have stepped away. We can see that the stones carried identity, memory, status, ritual, or some system of meaning. But we cannot sit beside them and hear the explanation from the people who carved them. That is what makes Tiya so haunting. It reminds us that meaning can survive materially while becoming unreachable intellectually. The sign remains. The key is gone. The stone has kept its side of the bargain, but human memory has not. All of these places raise the same careful possibility. The monuments may not be older than the civilizations credited with them in the simple sense. Some may belong exactly where archaeologists place them. Some may have been built by the very societies named in the textbooks, but the knowledge behind them may be older. The stoneworking traditions, sacred landscapes, burial customs, symbolic systems, and social habits that made these monuments possible may have been inherited from communities whose names were never written down. That is not a small thing. It means the most visible builders may not have been the first builders. The best preserved monuments may not mark the beginning of the tradition. The culture we can name may stand on foundations laid by people we cannot. This is where the idea of a forgotten civilization becomes both tempting and dangerous. It is tempting because the stones feel bigger than the explanation sometimes given to them. It is dangerous because a single dramatic lost civilization can become a shortcut that avoids the harder, more human truth. The forgotten builders may not have belonged to one vanished empire. They may have been many communities over many centuries. They may have been masons, quarry workers, ritual specialists, farmers, elders, chiefs, mourners, and families. They may have passed down techniques without writing them. They may have guarded sacred places without leaving inscriptions. They may have raised smaller stones before later rulers raised larger ones. They may have shaped the first habits of stone memory long before the monuments became famous enough for history to notice. In a way, that is more mysterious than one lost empire. A lost empire is a story with walls around it. Inherited knowledge has no single border. It moves through people. It changes hands. It survives in practice. It can be carried by a builder who does not know the full history of the method he uses. It can be preserved by a community that continues a ritual because the elders say it must be done. It can appear in a symbol carved long after its original meaning has shifted. It can stand in a sacred grove where no one cuts trees, not because of written law, but because the place has always been treated differently. This kind of older world does not vanish all at once. It thins, it blends. It becomes part of later worlds until only the stones still show the depth. The dating problem sits at the centre of this. When organic remains near a monument are dated, they help place one event in time. That event may be a burial, a ritual deposit, a construction layer, a repair, or a later use. But stone has long lives. A stone can be older as material, younger as a monument, older again as a symbol, and younger again as part of a later burial or sacred landscape. This does not mean we should distrust every date. It means we should ask what the date is actually dating. The first quarrying, the first raising, the burial beneath it, the last use of the site, the moment a later community made an older stone meaningful again. Ancient timelines are often built from real evidence, but evidence must be handled with its own limits in mind. A date is a lantern, not a sunrise. It lights part of the ground. It does not reveal everything. And perhaps this is why megaliths continue to fascinate us in so many parts of the world. They sit at the border between what can be measured and what can only be inferred. You can measure their height, weight, orientation, tool marks, weathering and position. You can excavate around them. You can compare them with other sites. You can test nearby material, but the human decision remains harder to reach. Why this stone? Why this place? Why this shape? Why so much effort? These questions are simple only until you try to answer them. Then they open into belief, power, grief, ancestry, labour, landscape, and memory. The Ethiopian monuments make that opening especially wide because they are so varied. If all the stones look the same, we might be able to force them into one explanation, but they do not. Aksum's stelae are royal and architectural. Yeha's stones are structural and sacred. Gedeo's megaliths are numerous and landscape-based. Tiya's stelae are carved and funerary. Their differences matter. They show that stone did not have one meaning in Ethiopia's past. It had many. It could hold a wall, mark a tomb, guard a ridge, display a symbol, claim authority, or preserve sacredness. The recurring use of stone does not prove one forgotten civilization behind everything. It proves something subtler. Across different regions and times, people returned to stone when memory needed weight. There is something deeply human in that. We turn to durable things when we fear forgetting. A grave marker, a temple wall, a standing stone, a carved sign, a family photograph, a handwritten note kept in a drawer, a name scratched into wet cement. The material changes, but the impulse is familiar. We want something to remain when the voice is gone. The builders of Ethiopia's megaliths may have lived in worlds very different from ours, but that desire is not difficult to understand. They knew that bodies vanish. They knew that wood decays. They knew that memory weakens, so they use stone. Not because stone explains everything, but because stone stays. And yet stone staying is not the same as meaning staying. That is the quiet sadness running through these sites. The monuments endured, but the full stories did not. The Aksumite stelae remain, but the exact ceremonies around them are gone. Yeha's walls remain, but the voices inside the old temple are gone. Gedeo's stones remain, and some traditions remain around them, but the first meanings of every stone cannot be recovered with certainty. Tiya's symbols remain, but their full reading is still out of reach. The past has given us the object and withheld part of the explanation. It is rather like receiving a beautifully wrapped gift with no note, then realizing the note may have been the most important part. Still, not knowing everything does not mean knowing nothing. This is where a calm kind of wonder is useful. We can say that Ethiopia's ancient societies were skilled, organized, and deeply connected to stone as a material of memory. We can say that later monuments likely grew from earlier traditions. We can say that some dates tell us about associated events rather than the entire life of a monument. We can say that the symbols at Tiya remain difficult to interpret, that Gedeo's landscape is unusually rich in standing stones, that Yeha's dry masonry shows impressive engineering, and that Aksum's granite stelae represent one of the great achievements of ancient African monumentality. We can also say that beneath these known facts lies a large amount of human history still unnamed. That unnamed history does not belong outside Ethiopia's story. It is Ethiopia's story. It belongs to the highlands, the rift, the sacred forests, the trade routes, the tombs, the quarries, the ridges, the churches, the old temples, the farms and the communities that kept living beside ancient stones long after their first meanings changed. The forgotten builders were not separate from the land. They were part of its long human depth. Their loss from record is not evidence that they were unimportant. It is only evidence that writing and survival are uneven. History often remembers those who commanded the work and forgets those who knew how to do it. So when the timeline goes quiet, perhaps the best response is not to force it to speak too loudly. We can stand with the uncertainty. We can let the stones be both evidence and mystery. We can respect what archaeology has established, while still recognizing that the earliest roots of knowledge may be older than the monuments we can confidently date. We can avoid both arrogance and fantasy. Arrogance says the official label explains everything. Fantasy says because we do not know everything, anything may be true. The better path is narrower and more patient. It says here is what we know, here is what we do not know, and here is where the stones invite us to keep looking. And now, after walking through Aksum, Yeha, Gedeo and Tiya, we are left with a different image of Ethiopia's megaliths. They are not simply isolated wonders. They are traces of long conversations between people and stone. They show how memory can become vertical, how sacredness can become architectural, how landscapes can hold ritual, and how symbols can survive after their meanings fade. They remind us that recorded kingdoms are only the visible surface of older human worlds. Beneath every named civilization are unnamed builders, and beneath every monument may be a tradition older than the monument itself. Perhaps that is what the megaliths whisper when the timeline goes quiet. Not a single answer. Not a secret that overturns everything. Not a dramatic confession carved into granite and waiting for someone clever enough to notice. Their message is slower than that. They tell us that human knowledge can outlive the names of those who carried it. They tell us that a stone may belong to one age and still preserve the memory of another. They tell us that the past is not always lost because it has disappeared. Sometimes it is lost because it has become part of something later, so deeply absorbed that only the outline remains. And here you are now, a little farther along your own timeline than when we began, having wandered from royal tombs to temple walls, from crowded stone ridges to carved signs no one can fully read. Maybe the room around you has grown quieter. Maybe the evening has settled. Maybe the old stones of Ethiopia feel very far away, or strangely close, as old places sometimes do when the mind begins to soften. So let me ask you once more gently, wherever you are, listening from tonight, what ancient place near you has always made you wonder? What wall, hill, ruin, field, road, church, graveyard, or standing stone has ever made you feel that the past was still there, not speaking loudly, but waiting? If this journey brought you calm, curiosity, or simply a peaceful place to rest your thoughts, I would be ever so grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, and stayed with this little corner of quiet exploration. There are many more old places on Earth, and many more questions that do not need to be hurried. For now, the stones remain where they are. Aksum's granite giants keep their watch. Yeha's walls keep their balance. Gedeo's standing stones remain among the living landscape. Tiya's symbols hold their unread message, and somewhere beneath the names we know, the forgotten builders remain present in the only way they still can, through the weight they left behind. Sleep well, fellow traveller, and let the old stones keep the night.